Christian Romance Audiobook, Freed by His Love, Book 4 in the Heroes of Eastbrooke Christian Romance Suspense series, written by Juliette Duncan, narrated by Jessie Sweeney.
Prologue. Unease over leaving Michaela behind churned inside ELI CARLTON. In his hurry to call the incident in, he hadn't been thinking clearly. Why hadn't the agent called it in himself? As he sped towards town, he shifted in his seat, gut clenching. Things shouldn't go this way. How many times had that niggling in his gut taunted him since the start of this undercover mission? Something wasn't right. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He'd learned long ago not to ignore his instincts, especially in matters of life and death. What had the agent said after he'd told the man not to let Michaela out of his sight? Oh, believe me, I won't. A shiver shot up his spine. Something hadn't been right about the response. Go back, a little voice whispered. Eli's pulse accelerated as he yanked the wheel and did a U-turn. At any other time, he'd have credited his instincts for this feeling, but this was something far bigger, like a whisper from God.
"Michaela, I'm coming," he called out before grabbing his radio. "Rob, I won't be coming in. I need to go back. Just send the team."
He didn't wait for an answer, hanging up. The last time he'd talked to God, it had been closer to cursing at the heavens than a prayer. But he spoke to him now.
"God, something's not right. If you're there, please protect Michaela until I get there. I know this is out of my hands, but I can't do it alone. Please help. Please."
A remarkable sense of reassurance settled over him, calming the raging fear, sustaining him until he arrived back at the bed and breakfast where he and Michaela were hiding, pretending to be newlyweds. He sucked in a sharp breath. There. The agent prodded Michaela to a van. Eli's hands went cold. The man had a gun pressed between her shoulder blades, the muzzle buried and hidden in her long silky hair. Forcing himself to move cautiously, Eli slipped out of the car and made his way towards the van. He trained his Glock on the man, breathing deeply to keep calm.
"God, this could go so wrong. I need your help. Please guide my actions. Please protect Michaela."
"Hold it right there." He approached the van in a crouching run, weapon held steady. Soft, recently dyed platinum blonde hair swirled around Michaela Horsburden as she spun her head to look at him, her pale skin paler than usual. She mouthed his name as if afraid to speak aloud. When the agent yanked her against him as a shield and slid the gun to her neck, Eli's stomach lurched. Chin high, back straight, she swallowed hard, every bit of her posture unyielding despite the danger.
"You get to choose how this plays out."
Years of training helped Eli keep his voice even.
"I've already called for backup. If they arrive and find you've harmed her, there's going to be a hefty price to pay. Cooperate, and you might get out of this easier. What do you choose?"
The imposter glared at him. "What kind of choice is that? Clearly you don't know your Harness's men. We don't give up easily." In the past, this remark would have enraged Eli. Instead, calm prevailed in his soul.
"Johannes is a dangerous man to be caught up with. Association with him already puts you in a perilous spot with the law. I'd think carefully about resisting, especially once backup arrives."
The man shook his head and took a step towards the van, dragging Michaela backwards with him. "I'm taking her with me. Try and stop me and I'll shoot."
"No."
At Michaela's voice, the imposter froze. He tilted his head towards her, jabbing the gun harder against her slim neck. "What do you mean, no?"
"No," she repeated, her voice strong. "I won't go with you."
"Huh?" Eli brought his other hand up, steadying the weapon, Weaver style. As diabolical as Johannes was, he'd prefer to have his niece delivered in one piece. Michaela must be relying on that. Eli, however, wasn't willing to take the chance. "You don't get a choice, missy." The man hauled her another step towards the van. "Let's go. And you, Carlton, stay back." Eli's throat closed when another heavily armed mercenary emerged from the van. One shouldn't go against two men without backup. But he didn't have a choice. His warning shot was fired into the air. Michaela screamed as the man dragged her towards the van while firing his weapon. Too frantic to be precise, his shots missed their mark. When it became clear he wasn't going to give up, Eli shot him in the leg. The man howled and clutched at the wound, spinning towards Eli, lowering his weapon just that fraction they needed. With him distracted, Michaela darted towards Eli. Another shot rang out, this time from the other man's gun. Michaela stumbled forward, and a strangled cry ripped from Eli's throat. "No!" Screeching sirens penetrated the whooshing in his ears, but it was distant and unimportant as he gathered her into his arms, growing cold while blood trickled down her neck. She'd been shot in the head. Tears sprang to his eyes, and his heart clenched. "Lord, please, no!" Law enforcement personnel swarmed them, but Eli saw only Michaela's face, now alarmingly pale. "You're going to be all right, Michaela," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Hold on. Help is coming." As he held her, he knew it. He loved this woman. He couldn't lose her now. Chapter 1. 3 weeks earlier. Weddings in Eastbrooke were always momentous affairs. In such a close-knit community, just about everyone made the guest list. Eli Carlton stood back with an absent smile as the bride and groom posed for the last photos, commemorating their special day. Laughter vibrated around him as folks fellowshipped and celebrated. Kids ran back and forth on the lawn while families milled around the refreshment table, laden with lemonade and freshly baked cookies. Eli's brother gave his bride another kiss on the lips, playfully dipping her backwards for the picture. Joseph was the third of the 4 Carlton brothers to be married, leaving Eli as the only single sibling. Although he had the love of his family and good friends, he couldn't help feeling left out. Of course, he would never show this. When his brothers teased him about being the only one left to walk down the aisle, he'd dismissed them. How else could he maintain his self-sufficient front? Working in the counter-terrorism unit in Melbourne, he didn't lack responsibility or purpose in his life. No one could deny that his work kept him busy. Then there was his deep-rooted desire to apprehend the man who'd killed his father years ago. Not just the murderer. He twisted his grip into fists at the thought of the white supremacist group, the White League, that continued to wreak havoc on Eastbrooke. Someone needed to take them down. So plenty in his life kept him occupied. And yet, all afternoon, he hadn't been able to stop staring at Michaela, the young woman 2 of his brothers had recently rescued from the terrifying clutches of pure light, a cult offshoot of the White League. He drained the last of the lemonade from his plastic cup, wishing it held something stronger. Not that he drank alcohol often, but right now he could do with a stiff drink. "You're just feeling left behind since you're here without a date, that's all." But it wasn't so simple. Ever since Michaela escaped the cult led by the family who was supposed to protect her, she kept invading his thoughts. His heart broke every time he recalled the anguish on her face the first time he'd seen her. She'd been trying to overcome the trauma she'd experienced, and he'd felt a surge of protectiveness. And something else he was afraid to name. "All right, let's get a photo with everyone now. The whole crew," the cameraman hollered. Max, his eldest brother, clapped Eli on the back and nodded towards the flowery trellis, serving as the backdrop. "Come on, bro." He then waved to Michaela standing off to the side alone. She had such big grey eyes. They always seemed to be looking at everything with wonderment, as if she couldn't believe such a normal life were possible. "You too, Michaela. Come on." Those peachy lips that had at first seemed afraid to smile twitched into the beginning of such an expression as she moved forward readily, her yellow bridesmaid's dress casting an angelic glow on her. Her smile downright distracting. The way she'd regained the confidence the cult's brainwashing had stolen from her was nothing short of a miracle. However, after spending time with Eli's family, she'd moved to Melbourne and into a safe house where she'd undertaken a de-radicalisation program while helping the counter-terrorism department with their inquiries. It seemed each day she further regained her joy and sense of purpose. As happy as he was for his brother and new sister-in-law, Eli scuffled over to the group, dragging his feet before the final round of photos. He slipped in beside Michaela while doing his best to keep the butterflies dancing in his stomach under control. He was an expert who analysed the most brutal members of society. How was it, then, that a petite young woman with a gentle demeanour and enormous eyes could send his heart into such a state of disarray? As he stepped in alongside the other bridesmaids and groomsmen, her floral perfume teased his senses. "It's just the smell of the roses, nothing more." But just when he thought he had his emotions under control, she tossed a smile over her shoulder, her russet hair slipping over her shoulder with it, and his heart went tumbling over itself. Even though nothing was mildly flirtatious about the look. "Okay, on 3, the cameraman directed. 1, 2... Eli summoned a smile, aware of only one thing: the woman beside him driving him nuts. When Joseph and Holly got into their car and drove away to cheers and clanking cans dangling from the back bumper, relief loosened Eli's taut muscles. Sure, the reception had been fun, but maybe now he could return to his comfort zone. After helping take down the tables and clean up, he made his escape towards his truck.
"I'm going to stay and mingle with the guests,"
his mother announced, beaming from the excitement.
"See you at home?"
As much as he treasured time with his family, he let his shoulders droop, so it wouldn't be a full escape to Melbourne where his interactions with Michaela would have the protective layer of a professional setting. How had he forgotten he'd agreed to stay the night in Eastbrooke and leave tomorrow rather than set out directly after the festivities? He forced a smile and did his best to shake the melancholy. "Sure, I'll have a hot chocolate waiting for you." She squeezed his shoulder and smiled before she dashed off. A little while later, Eli scooted his chair back as Rob, his second eldest brother, joined him on the front porch of their family home. "Mum needn't have worried about the wedding's success." Rob eased into a wicker chair opposite Eli and crossed his legs. "The whole thing went off without a hitch. How often do you think that would happen?" Eli gave a small chuckle before sipping his hot chocolate. "Not often. Except Michaela's mere presence and its effect on him had been a huge hitch. At least, no one else noticed." He inhaled and studied the burnt orange horizon as the sun slipped behind the mountain towering over the town. To outsiders, Eastbrooke was a vast wilderness miles from civilization, but to him and his brothers, it was home, and the open land grounded them. After growing up here, he revelled in his element and saw the beauty in it. However, he remained aware of the dangerous roughness within, namely the White League. As their mother bustled around in the kitchen preparing another round of hot chocolate, Rob leaned closer, his voice dropping to the serious tone he used as the chief of police here. "Any developments on the Horsburdens?" Untangling the League felt never-ending, but the details of the Horsbidden family behind its inception were becoming clearer. Eli swirled the hot chocolate left in his mug, stirring up the settling cocoa. Releasing a heavy breath, he shifted his gaze back to Rob. We know for certain Johannes was the original leader. Years of controlling his emotions allowed him to keep his anger hidden, but the rage against his father's killer simmered deep inside him, sending heat now coursing through his blood. Was Johannes directly responsible? Eli's grip tightened on the cup, clenching so hard he almost feared to break it. He forced it to loosen, with the same patience he kept his expression neutral. But he wouldn't stop until he knew and brought whoever it was to justice. A possum with a baby clinging to its back skittered along the top of the side fence, the streetlight illuminating its outline. It stopped and sniffed the air, its nose twitching before it scooted up a grevillea tree and hid amongst the branches. That brings us one step closer to subduing the lot of them. Rob stretched his long legs out before him, crossing them at the ankles, as relaxed as if they were still discussing the wedding. His boot heels rocked against the wooden porch. Knowing who's behind the cult is a huge milestone. No one should have gone through the emotional harm the cult's warped ideologies caused Michaela. Eli's anger burned with even more ferocity, and his chest began to heave. Raised in a Christian family, he was well aware the cult's beliefs did not align with those taught in the Bible. His mother and brothers had accepted Jesus as their Lord and Saviour and were passionate about their faith. Eli remembered asking the Lord into his heart once as well. But that was before Dad was killed. Faith in someone he couldn't see had felt futile after that. Since then, he'd clung to the belief that, if he wanted someone to pay for their father's murder, he'd have to handle it himself. Revenge isn't the way, little brother. Eli narrowed his eyes. Who said anything about revenge? Rob sat back, his boot heels rocking again, the sound somehow hollow. You don't like to admit it, but I know you almost as well as you know yourself. Not much you can hide from me. Eli set his mug aside and rested his elbows on his knees, his back hunched. There's a time and place for retribution. We're talking about the man who took Dad from us, not to mention what happened to Michaela. Despite the gravity, a knowing look crossed Rob's face. Eli groaned. He had to keep himself in check. He hadn't the faintest idea how to deal with these stirrings for Michaela. No way could he let others speculate on them. Anyone in our situation would be indignant. I agree. Rob crossed his legs. But in most cases, anyone involved wouldn't be allowed to be part of the investigation. Bristling, Eli scrubbed a hand over his face. We've already discussed this. Rob raised his hands. But I've always been concerned about you being so involved. Eli arched a brow. You're afraid I'll do something stupid? When his brother nodded, Eli's gut twisted. Not being allowed to continue now they were getting close would be no less than torture. You're stellar at what you do, little brother, but you're also hot-headed. Eli pursed his lips. Out with it. Do you think I should be off the case? Spreading his hands, palms up, Rob huffed. No, I simply want you to put the idea of revenge aside so you can do your job with a clear head. Whew. Eli slouched back against the wicker chair. I'll do my best. It was a promise. He'd do whatever it took to find the man he'd been hunting and make him pay.
You boys ready for seconds?
Their mother called from the kitchen. Sure, Mum, I could use another cup. Rob stood and clapped Eli on the shoulder. You do your job, Eli, and let God do his. Eli exhaled and made no move to follow his brother. Let God do his job? Had God been doing his job when Dad was murdered? He ran a restless hand through his hair as hate writhed inside him. Not hatred at God, exactly, more against the White League. But if God had done his job, maybe Eli wouldn't have had to grow up without a dad. George Carlton might have been present to watch his third son get married, and maybe he could have offered advice on matters of the heart. A moth fluttering around the porch light caught Eli's attention. The bulb's soft glow reminded him of Michaela's bridesmaid dress. How gorgeous and feminine she'd looked. Would he ever be in a place where he was worthy of her? After being rescued from the cult, she'd devoted her life to Christ. She'd invited him to the church she'd become a part of in Melbourne once. When he declined in favour of putting in extra hours on the case, she hadn't pressed. He appreciated that. She must know all too well the damage an imposed faith could cause. He shook his head. Although he was drawn to her, a chasm would exist between them as long as he pushed God away. But he wasn't ready to welcome the Lord back into his life. Not yet, anyway. Chapter 2. If only there was a light so she could find her way through the darkness, but fumbling in the dark in search of an electrical switch was pointless. Illumination, something Michaela had taken for granted in the real world, was a precious commodity within the commune. It was rationed, the same as all other comforts, including independence. She shivered. Just a tiny glimmer of light would have brought comfort. She yearned for that comfort now as much as she had on her first night in the commune. Stumbling through the gloom, she groped for the cabin door, her breaths coming fast as panic clawed in. She had to get out. It felt darker than usual. Where was the doorknob? There. She turned it, but it didn't budge. She twisted harder before she yanked it, her pulse jumping. It still didn't open. She whirled around, her chest heaving. "Holly?" Holly had been her only beacon of hope since Michaela's arrival here. In fact, she had no idea why the woman, who didn't seem to fit, was there, but Michaela was sure glad of her company. "Holly!" she yelled louder. No response. Where was she? Why wasn't she answering? Michaela crumpled to the ground. She was on her own. Locked in. Forgotten. Gut-wrenching sobs overtook her as she wrapped her arms around her body and shivered. "Help!" she whimpered. "Somebody, help!" Sitting bolt upright in bed, she gasped for breath and stared at a shaft of pale moonlight beyond the window. Drawing her knees to her chest, she hugged them and panted. She wasn't up there in the mountains, in that cabin. She was in Jean Carlton's home in Eastbrooke, and she was safe. Her breath slowed. Reaching for the throw blanket at the foot of the bed, she snuggled it around her shoulders and settled against the headboard. When her heart's wild pounding subsided, she switched on the lamp and took her Bible from the nightstand, flipping it open to one of the many verses she'd marked and kept for when times such as this threatened the peace she'd found in her faith. Proverbs 18:10 was first. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous man runs into it and is safe. Exhaling, she lifted her gaze to the window. Pure light had promised many things: community, daily food, and even safety. But of all the emotions she'd felt during her time there, a sense of safety was not one of them. Her cousins, Sally and Carl, had convinced her being with them was in her best interests, and they were there to look out for her. But the doctrine they based their beliefs on was sorely misguided. For a long time, she hadn't known what was so wrong with it, even as she'd been convinced their motives were far from pure. Now she knew the source of that unsettledness. The Holy Spirit had been guiding her heart, whispering to her conscience that there was a better way. God's true way. Jesus. He was the way, the truth, and the life. Her eyes slid shut, her prayer leaving her lips in a whisper.
Lord, thank you for pulling me to safety and that I never have to be shut away in darkness again. Thank you for bringing me into a community that honours you, and for folks like the Carltons who truly have my best interests at heart.
When Eli's face come unbidden to her mind, her heart flip-flopped. He was the only member of the family who didn't have a deep-rooted faith in Christ. The moment she'd met him, she'd sensed an undeniable struggle in his soul. Once she heard how the Carltons' father had been taken by violence, she understood why he struggled. She prayed daily for him to find the rest she found every day in the Lord. Healing from the brainwashing wasn't accomplished overnight, and the mending of Eli's shattered heart wouldn't be either. But she could feel the Holy Spirit working inside her every day, drawing her closer each time she reached out for help. God would take care of Eli in his struggle as well, if he let him. Opening her eyes, she flipped her slippery hair away from her face and turned to another marked page. Deuteronomy 31:6 flooded her soul with another wave of reassurance. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. After her experience, she was convinced of the truth of these words. No matter what was happening, and no matter how difficult it was to understand, God had a plan and a purpose for her life. Even as she'd struggled against the cult and the havoc it wreaked within her, he'd been there, holding her life in the palm of his hand.
He holds your life too, Eli,
she murmured into the quiet. Though she knew no Christian was beneath another, as each was a treasured child of God, the moment he or she accepted Jesus as their Saviour, she set the Bible aside and tucked her chin against her upraised knees, pressing them tight to the aching in her heart. How could she help feeling underqualified to guide Eli towards the Lord? She still had so much to learn. Eli knew this better than anyone, as he held a protector role in her life. They'd become quite close during her time undergoing de-radicalization in Melbourne. She sighed, turning her chin so her cheek rested against her knees. She felt something for him. However, weaving together hopes for a man who didn't share her newfound faith was inadvisable. She could support him and be a friend, but she'd best guard her heart. They were both in fragile places with their faith, and she couldn't let anything interfere with their spiritual journeys. They were both in God's capable hands. Laying back on her pillow, she prayed for him until she drifted back to sleep. Chapter 3. Johannes poured another cup of gritty black coffee. Taking a sip of the strong brew, he stared out the cabin window at a Swiss mountain. Which one? He couldn't remember and didn't care. Until recently, he'd been in Melbourne, close enough to Eastbrooke to control the White League's operations, but far away enough to remain inconspicuous. The authorities were closing in, and it irked him. First, the mountain drug bust, then that reporter, Holly, infiltrating Pure Light. Both compromised his and his son's business workings. Severely. They needed to tread lightly to escape the Carltons. A low growl issued from his throat. That family had been nothing but trouble from the start. He slugged another gulp of the brutal coffee. He'd done away with George Carlton before he'd known those mongrel boys were a threat. But the man's sons remained a pain in his backside, and now in his son, Carl's as well. Hence Switzerland. He snickered. How easy it was to outmaneuver those who thought they were in control. A call coming in pulled his gaze from the window and the snow-covered Alps. Settling into a solid oak armchair, He answered the video call from Guy, his right-hand man back in Melbourne.
"What have you got?"
Johannes drummed his fingers on the rustic wooden table.
"We need a solid plan, something foolproof to shake off the law for good. We have to if we don't want our operation to go up in flames."
Guy chuckled as he ran a rag over the Colt M1911 that was as much a part of him as his appendages.
"Flames? Aren't the righteous saved from the flames?"
The quip fell flat, and he raised his hands in surrender.
"Sorry, bad joke."
Johannes levelled him with a glare. He was in no mood to be sidetracked. Setting his gun aside, Guy leaned forward.
"Infiltrating the media will be our surest way. A smear campaign against the cops. Undermine their authority."
Already shaking his head, Johannes speared Guy with his steely gaze.
"It's not enough. We need something more."
Guy quirked an eyebrow.
"I wasn't finished."
A huff jumped up Johannes's chest. He slapped the table, making his laptop jump as well.
"I should hope not. Go on." "A platform of distrust through social media could pave the way for the League to take political control."
That was better. Johannes sipped his coffee, tasting a bit of success in its gritty reality.
"I could see that being beneficial."
Guy snorted.
"Beneficial is an understatement. Mark my words."
Guy was by no means perfect. It was hard for a lackey to be perfect all the time, especially in this business. The tough calls they made left plenty of room for misjudgment. But Guy had seen a thing or two, and Johannes respected him.
"With a foothold within politics, we'll be seen as a legitimate entity rather than one chased by the authorities."
Guy grinned, revealing a gold tooth. Corrupt dealings were Johannes's primary merchandise, apart from white supremacy, of course. Although he didn't set much store by faith, Pure Light had embodied the idea of continuing the elite white race. Men and women within the cult married each other and were encouraged to produce multiple offspring to keep the line going. As long as the line from Pure Light continued, the White League would continue. The two entities worked in conjunction, and Johannes would guard against their destruction, no matter what it took.
"All right. Put everything you've suggested into motion."
His phone buzzed, displaying the number of the prison incarcerating Carl.
"I've got to go."
He shut down their video connection, then answered the call.
"Do you have any news?"
Little point in asking how his son was doing. Real men ended up behind bars at one point or another. Whining about it didn't get anything done. Their energy needed to be on furthering the League. After a shuffling on the other end, Carl spoke, his voice barely above a whisper.
"Michaela's safe house has been located."
Warm satisfaction uncoiled in Johannes's gut, energizing him more than the wretched coffee. Savouring it, he sank back in his chair.
"You have some of our people keeping an eye on her?"
"I do."
Carl cleared his throat.
"But something else. She's under the protection of ELI CARLTON."
"What?"
Johannes jolted upright, slamming his knee against the table and cursing under his breath.
"I might have known they'd choose one of the brothers to watch over her. Those Carltons."
He let out several more curses.
"He watches her like an emu guarding its chicks, my source says," Carl continued.
"He's a guard,"
Johannes snapped.
"That's what they do."
Great. Yet another obstacle the Carltons presented. They had mastered the art of thwarting the League's plans.
"Do whatever needs to be done to bring her in."
"I'm on it. That little traitor."
Carl's curses sang into Johannes's ears, his son's equal hatred soothing him.
"But there's more to it."
Johannes's brows drew together as he shifted into a more authoritative position in his chair in preparation. Didn't matter what it was. He could handle it. He would handle it.
"Well, go on.
What is it?" After more shuffling on the other end in the background, a prison guard told Carl to wrap it up. Johannes stiffened. Though prison was a hazard of the job, having his son behind bars with people telling him what to do grated. He should have been helping to retrieve Michaela. "She has information that will put us in jeopardy," Carl whispered. "If we don't catch her, we are all in trouble." Before Johannes could press further, the call ended. He slammed his phone down and stared at the wall. What information did that Drongo Sheila have? He couldn't wait until his son's next phone call to find out. He called Guy back. "Who of our group will be best invading a safe house? It's time for my niece to return to the fold." Chapter 4. When Max and Janir extended the invitation for Eli and Michaela to remain a few days longer in Eastbrooke, they accepted. Due to his current role as her protector, Eli had flexibility and no need to rush back as long as she was within his sight. Did she even know how much danger she was in? Whenever he quizzed her, she replied that God was looking out for her, which was a weird thing to say because he, Eli CARLTON, was the one fulfilling that role. He pulled up in front of the family home behind Max and Janir's car. Dusk was setting in, but an orange tinge lingered on the horizon, silhouetting the mountain towering over the town. He sat in the car and stared at it. Staying longer in Eastbrooke felt almost like a holiday, but being constantly alert, watching out for Michaela, and searching for clues to his father's killer kept him far from relaxed. Still, none of that caused his restlessness. That was Michaela herself. Every word she uttered, every move she made distracted him. All she had to do was walk into a room, and he could not look away from her. Her smile lit up the room like the rising sun. When she walked past him, all he could do was think about how she would fit perfectly under his arm. When she spoke, the sincerity in her voice enthralled him. Face it, she was the most entrancing woman he'd ever met. When his mother suggested the family get together for a spaghetti dinner and games night, his apprehension skyrocketed. Most of the time he was around Michaela, his family wasn't there. Could he keep his feelings hidden in such a homey and familiar setting, surrounded by people who knew him better than anyone else on earth? He doubted it, but he had no choice. He climbed out of the car, grabbing the paper bag holding the carton of ice cream he'd been asked to bring, and loped up the stairs 2 at a time, the wood thudding under his boots. And stilled. He swiped a hand over his hair, the short strands pricking against his palm, and drew deep breaths, reluctant to go inside despite the melting ice cream. He needed to gather his thoughts and emotions that could so easily betray him with one swift glance from Michaela. He shifted his grip on the now soggy paper bag. The ice cream was going to drop through the bottom soon if he didn't get it inside. When Michaela had come to Melbourne after Joseph and Rob rescued her and Holly from Pure Light, Eli volunteered to look out for her. It made sense since he was based there, and other than her family and the cult, she didn't have close relations. Everyone needed a support system, especially someone who had undergone such trauma. Although she was under no immediate threat since both her cousins were in jail, they deemed she still needed some level of protection from the others in the League. Her uncle Johannes, for one. She knew more about the League than she thought she did, and Eli hoped that, without even knowing, she might lead him to his father's killer. But thinking of her as only a family friend or a means to an end had become difficult. The more he saw of her, the more she caused his heart to stir. Unsure what to do with these emotions or even how to label them, he kept them to himself. Or at least, he tried to.
Eli, is that you out there?
His mother called through the open window.
Yes, Mum. Inhaling deeply, he opened the door. Voices of his family floated through the air. His mouth went dry when Michaela's laughter rose above the commotion. She'd travelled there with Max, Janir and Polly, their little daughter, while he spent the day at the station. His mother breezed into the hallway, clicking her tongue.
"What were you doing standing out there on the porch letting the ice cream melt?"
He sent her a smile that helped him charm his way out of trouble. "I was taking in the view. It's a beautiful evening." It wasn't a lie. She kissed him on the cheek and claimed the ice cream.
"It won't be if our vanilla ice cream for the blackberry pie is reduced to milkshake consistency. Hang your coat and come into the living room."
He had little choice but to follow her orders as she headed into the kitchen. Even after the mental preparation to see Michaela, he hadn't been prepared for how his heart surged as he sighted her sitting amongst his family. Her face alight while she played with Polly. They already had Candyland out on the floor, and Michaela looked at ease, as if she belonged and always had. "We thought you'd never show up," Joseph chided, tossing an arm around Eli's shoulder. No missing the glow in his eyes. Marriage clearly agreed with him. Some bridegrooms would have been put out by not setting off on a honeymoon trip, but Holly and Joseph had opted to wait a couple of months for when they had more time. Joseph had just begun his coursework in seminary, while Holly was establishing herself as a freelance journalist. Coupled with his continued work on the Eastbrooke Mountain Rescue Team, a lot was going on in their lives. Neither seemed to mind. Seated on the couch, sipping lemonade, Rob and Emma crooned over Isaac, the newest Carlton clan member. "Ready for some good old-fashioned competition?" Holly tapped the stack of games on the coffee table. Eli forced himself not to look when he felt Michaela's gaze on him. "I sure am." Wow, listen to that. His voice sounded so normal.
"Dinner first,"
his mother called from the kitchen.
"It's ready. Come and get it."
No one had to be asked twice. When Michaela took a seat beside him at the long oak table, he groaned. How would he survive an entire meal with her so close? Once they were all seated, his mother smiled at Joseph.
"Would our pastor-to-be like to say grace?"
Joseph returned her smile. "I'd be honoured." Although Eli had sat at this very table and joined in the saying of grace for years, he felt particularly left out today when Michaela bowed her head along with his family. He was the only one for which this routine didn't serve as a personal moment of connection with God. Even amidst his conflicted emotions towards the Lord, he started to wish he could share in the meaning of the prayer in the same way the others did, but too much had happened for him to do that. Too much had been taken away. "Heavenly Father," Joseph prayed, "thank you for bringing our family together for another meal around this table. It's such a blessing. Thank you for keeping us all under your protection when we are apart. We don't take your provision for granted." Eli shifted in his seat. How could everyone around him feel the Lord's protection over them daily? Seriously, guys, where was God's protective hand when Dad needed it? Although the question entered his mind regularly, having it pop into his head while his brother was thanking God for his provision felt incongruous, and bitterness chilled his core. When Joseph wrapped up the prayer and spaghetti and salad bowls were passed around, Eli licked his bottom lip and managed to quell his anger. Disturbed by his brother's prayer, he forgot Michaela's presence until she handed him the salad bowl. "How are you, Eli?" He cleared his throat. "I'm well. How are you?" Had she any idea what her huge eyes and innocent face were doing to him? "Good." She shook his mother's homemade lemon and honey vinaigrette onto her salad. "I'm always grateful to be here with your family. It had been a long time since I experienced this kind of camaraderie. I didn't realize how much I've missed it." Everything bitterness had turned hard and cold melted, and warmth welled inside him.
Her parents had been killed in a car crash when she was 18 and heading off to university. Not long after, right when she was vulnerable and needing support, Sally and Carl had pulled her into pure light under the guise of helping her. The very thought angered him. "I'm sorry you didn't have more time with your parents." This he could relate to. "It's hard losing one parent. I can't imagine losing both." Her smile wobbled at its edges, those peachy lips sliding flat. "It's difficult for sure. What about the rest of your family? Apart from, you know." Ugh, how could he be such a dill? When he was around her, what happened to the confident guy who knew what he wanted to say? Who was this awkward imposter in his chair letting words he didn't intend tumble from his mouth? "Besides Sally and Carl, you mean?" she supplied, shielding him from further embarrassment. Without an answer, she continued. "It's sad. There was a feud between my family members for, well, I don't remember a time when there wasn't a feud. My parents rarely talked with my other relatives. I don't even know them." Eli's brow lowered. What was the feud about? She shrugged as she accepted the spaghetti bowl from Holly on her other side. "My parents didn't talk about it, so I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if things would have been different if I had support from the rest of my family." "You mean you might not have joined the cult?" She nodded. "I'm not questioning the way God chose to work it all out, but I do wonder." The endearing blush that overtook her face when she realized she'd become lost in her thoughts made Eli's throat thick. He wanted to reach out and squeeze her hand, assure her she was safe, that she was amongst people who cared. "I'm grateful your family has embraced me, and I get to come to events such as this." Ducking her head, she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I second that." Holly, who'd been listening in, piped up. "I never dreamed I would get to be part of a family like this." Apparently the whole table was listening in on the conversation. His mother's eyes shone. She smiled as she lifted her iced tea glass.
"I say we propose a toast. To family."
Everyone lifted their glasses, clinking them together as they echoed her words. As Eli exchanged a smile with Michaela before drinking from his glass, he wondered if she could see right through him. Could she see what having her here with his family was doing to his heart? Rob's phone buzzed, drawing Eli from his contemplation. Since the family had demanding jobs, phones were never outlawed at the table. No one knew when they might be needed. Rob pulled his phone out of his pocket and frowned.
"Who is it?"
Their mother tilted her head at him, her brow wrinkling. "Jerry." He pushed his chair back and stood. "Sorry, I've got to take this." Jerry, Rob's partner long before Rob was promoted to chief of police, continued to be his right-hand man. He'd been involved in the League investigation from the start, working as hard as the Carlton brothers. A call from him on an evening he knew Rob would be with his family was not a good sign. Rob moved away from the table. Everyone other than Polly, who continued chatting away in ignorant bliss, stopped eating. Michaela's face was taut. Eli's heart twisted, and he slid his hands under the table, fisting them out of sight. Pure light, and indirectly the White League, had caused her so much trauma. His resolve to put an end to the group strengthened. "No, are you serious?" Low but audible, Rob's words drifted into the dining room. Eli stiffened, and a chill ran through him. By the time Rob ended his conversation, Michaela had gone pale. "What's happened, Rob?" Slipping his phone back into his pocket, he swung his serious gaze around the table before settling it on Michaela as he answered her. "The safe house in Melbourne's been attacked." She gasped, and her eyes widened. Holly placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Michaela swallowed hard. What happened?" Rob's gaze flicked to Eli. 2 men broke in and went straight for your room. Her face paled further, and air whooshed from her lungs.
They've found me.
Don't worry. Emma leaned forward and patted Michaela's arm. You can stay with Rob and me as long as you need. Don't you think that's best, Rob? He nodded. I do. At least until we know more details. Michaela glanced back and forth between the pair.
Are you sure? I don't want to put you both in danger.
Your safety is our priority. Rob's jaw hardened as his chin lifted. That's what we need to think about. We're all in this together. As he watched his brother's calm control, Eli's every protective instinct raged, and those hands, already fisted under the table, tightened so hard his knuckles might pop. He would not think of what would have happened if Michaela had been at the safe house. He would not. She would have been captured, or worse. She was in danger, and he needed to take care of her. I'll be on watch too. She gave him a small, grateful smile, with her large eyes even bigger now. She looked almost on the verge of tears. Finger by finger, he loosened his fists. He would get whoever was responsible. Why couldn't they leave her alone? She knew too much. She was a threat to Horsburden and his organisation, even if she didn't think so. As Rob and the others went on making further arrangements, all Eli could think about was keeping Michaela safe. When he answered the video phone, Johanna skipped the pleasantries. Did you get her? We got to her place, yes. Of all the... What kind of answer was that? He waved a hand to speed Guy up. And? She wasn't there, boss. His every muscle coiling tight, Johanna somehow kept from shaking the video screen. You broke into her place when she wasn't there? How on earth did you make that mistake? Sorry, boss. There was nothing else to say. Guy had failed. All right. Johannes rubbed a hand over his face. This was what happened when both his children were imprisoned. One could never trust help outside the family. We know she's palsy-walsy with those Carltons. If she isn't at the safe house, she'll be with them. Find them. Find her. Don't fail me. Yes, boss. Listen carefully. Johannes scooped up the laptop, pressing his face close to the camera's eye. Whatever it takes to get past those Carlton brothers, do it. They'll do anything to protect that piece of trash. Now it's time to play them at their own game. Kill them, if that's what's needed to get your hands on that little brat. He leaned even closer, his eyes burning. Whatever it takes. Do you understand? Absolutely. Chapter 5. Baby Isaac grinned at Michaela from his car seat. Emma laughed as Michaela reached in to unhook him. I'm pretty sure he's found his new favourite source of entertainment. He entertained me during the drive as well, Michaela chuckled. She'd been grateful for the distraction Emma and Rob's adorable little boy provided. When Emma invited her to do some shopping with her and Rob, Michaela had agreed to keep her mind off the raid. She shivered. What would have happened if she hadn't been miles away with the Carltons? With a deep breath, she closed her eyes and focused on something the local pastor said in one of his sermons. When our anxious thoughts and feelings linger, so should we in the presence of our great high priest who understands every human emotion we've ever felt, even though he's the God of the universe. Like other times those anxious thoughts crept in, she prayed and kept praying until her fears subsided and her peace returned. She'd escaped, but she wasn't free of the cult or the organization behind it. And her family members were the ones after her. Would she ever be free of them? She stepped aside as Eli closed his car door. She hadn't known he was joining them on the shopping trip until the last minute. She felt safe when he was near, but he, too, seemed on edge. That he didn't turn to the Lord for comfort grieved her. She sent up a silent prayer that, one day soon, he'd open his heart to God's love. "All right, what's first on the list?" Rob hoisted Isaac's carrier into the crook of his arm. Michaela smiled. How well being a father suited him. All the brothers had a reassuring, protective air, even Eli. Would he want a family someday? "The department store," Emma replied. "We all need something from there." "I don't," Eli protested, holding his hands out and doing a quick twirl. Emma rolled her eyes. "Why do men put up such a fight when it comes to getting new shirts?" He shrugged. "The old ones are comfortable. I don't see a reason for new ones." "Trust me, you need them." His sister-in-law locked the car, then tossed a wink in Michaela's direction. "Besides, it never hurts to look your best." Michaela's face heated. Had Emma noticed her fondness for Eli? She glanced at him to see his reaction, but looked away when their gazes met. He cleared his throat. "All right, my dear sister-in-law, whatever you say goes. I'll get a new shirt." Harsh lights and soft music greeted them as they stepped into the coolness beyond the automated doors. Posters hung above each department, their glossy likeness beckoning customers to investigate their offerings. Michaela found it hard to be interested. Either the raid or Eli himself was distracting her. Every time his gaze met hers, her pulse quickened, and by the time they were in the baby section picking out new onesies, she had a feeling it was a combination of both. As she inspected the baby shoes, clothes and blankets, she tried to push away the unease. Rob had assured her staying with him and Emma would be her safest option. He was the police chief, after all. Still, something cold threaded up her spine. She'd suspected Carl would stop at nothing to get her back. Could he still be so effective while incarcerated? Gripping the baby shirt she was feigning interest in, she let the busy department store and garish lights fade from her consciousness. "Lord, when I asked you into my life, your promise to never leave or forsake your children became a truth in my life. This situation is not out of your control. You've placed me where you want me to be, and I know you're watching out for me, for all of us, no matter what schemes Carl and the others might have. Thank you for your protection. Even now, help me hand my fears and anxiety to you." Isaac doesn't need another footy sleeper, but this one with dinosaurs is so cute. I might have to get it. Emma held the item up to Rob. "A boy can never have enough dinosaurs." Such fondness softened his gaze as he looked down at the infant slumbering in his carrier. "You'd buy him everything in the store if you could," Emma teased. "I'm going to need to be careful, or this man is going to spoil our child, Michaela." Michaela forced a smile. "He's so cute. It's hard not to want to buy him everything in sight." Though praying had served as a good reminder about who was in control of the situation, her stomach tightened into painful knots as fear continued to twist at it. She didn't realize her inner turmoil had reached her face until Eli arrived at her side. His brow knit. "Are you okay?" Beginning to shiver, she wrapped her arms around herself. "I think I'll step outside for a minute. I need some air." He took her elbow. "I'll go with you." She eased away from his touch, further disorientated by the way his nearness made her heart flutter. "Thanks, but there's no need. I'll get a little air and I'll come right back." An uneasy furrow to his brow. He nodded. She hurried away before he could change his mind. Outside, she slumped against the cement brick wall and sucked in a deep breath. Her pulse pounding in her head deafened her. She shut her eyes and leaned her head back, her hair snagging on the wall's rough edges. warm sunlight caressing her bare arms as if God sent it to soothe her. Good. Her breathing became more even. Just a few more minutes, a few more deep breaths before she could rejoin the others. A car engine and footsteps drew her eyes open. A man in a black sweatshirt stopped in front of her. Probably just passing by. Her heart rate kicked up again. Just her paranoia. No reason to make a scene. But he was looking at her. A scream started in her belly, but died in her throat as he jammed a gun into her side and clamped a hand over her mouth. She rammed her elbows against him, hitting hard torso, then wrenched to one side, trying to shake away, but he held fast as if she hadn't moved. Leaving the store without Eli was a dangerous mistake. Clawing at the man, she struggled. Prayerful words flooded her head in desperate pleas.
God, please help me. Tell Eli to come.
She bit at his hand, her heels pushing hard against the pavement to stop him from shoving her forward. Still, every moment brought her closer to the grey car he clearly intended on taking her away in. She was about to give up hope when his grip loosened. She tumbled to the ground, picking herself up, and scrambled away. Reaching a safe distance, she looked back, and her eyes widened. Eli wrestled the gun from the man while Rob struggled to secure him. He was putting up a good fight.
Kidnapping in broad daylight. You're a gutsy one,
Rob panted as the man continued to wrestle against him. The man, whose dark beard and beady eyes made Michaela's stomach lurch, slammed a fist to Rob's stomach.
You'll regret this.
Eli already had his phone out and was speaking with someone. She slumped against the wall, panting. The moment he was off the phone, Eli was crouching by her side. He reached as if to touch her, then rubbed his hands on his thighs instead.
Are you all right?
She nodded, her chest heaving.
I think so. It all happened so fast.
He just came up and grabbed you? Eli arched a brow. She shuddered. Feeling the man's hand on her mouth, his clamp on her middle.
Yes.
Rob and Eli exchanged a look. She should have realized they'd looked for her in Eastbrooke. Why had she put the family at risk? Jerry and his guys came and took charge of the angry man. Michaela shivered when he sent her a withering glare as they directed him into the back of the police car.
Come on.
Eli placed his arm around her, helping her away from the wall and ushering her towards the car park.
Let's get you to the car.
She drew comfort from his fiercely protective expression. I'll get Emma and the baby, Rob said. We'll meet you at the car. Michaela only managed a few steps before her knees buckled. She gripped the front of Eli's shirt as her body began to shake. You're in shock. Even amidst the paralyzing cold overtaking her body, she felt steadier when he pulled her closer and supported her.
I'm sorry. I never should have let you go outside alone.
As regret twisted up his face, her heart broke.
It's not your fault. You didn't know they'd come for me right then.
His mouth set in a grim line. I knew they were still after you, so I shouldn't have let you out of my sight. There was no excuse for me to put you in danger. Without thinking, she took his hand.
Don't blame yourself. I'm fine. We're all fine, and the man's been caught.
He shook his head. I should be the one comforting you, not the other way around. She gave a wobbly smile.
It shook us all. Please don't blame yourself.
He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to their intertwined fingers. I don't usually make such careless mistakes. She could only imagine how frustrating this must be after he'd been so vigilant for so long. She should have let him go with her. She squeezed his hand as they reached the car. God had me in his care. Shifting his weight, he glanced away, clearly uncomfortable, before meeting her gaze.
It's safe to say your cousin is determined to get you back. We need to figure out how to protect you better.
Steady and calm, his voice held a steely determination. He would do things his way, without God. Her heart sank.
Chapter 6.
Eli's hands balled into fists as he glared at the man through the interrogation room's one-way glass. The police station's midday bustle buzzed around him, but nothing could distract him from the man who had snatched Michaela. The man sat there, ramrod straight, his bearded chin high, his severe, criminal-hardened face unmoving. A difficult one to crack, but Eli would make him talk. Standing there, fighting thoughts of someone dragging Michaela off made his desire to protect her much stronger. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Rob clamped a hand on his shoulder. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Eli faced him. "What are you talking about? I've completed countless interrogations." Head tilted to one side, Rob eyed him. "Not in this type of situation." In, out. Expression neutral. "Don't say I'm too closely related to this case to be objective. We've already settled that. I'm staying on the case until we find Dad's killer." His brother shook his head. "What I mean is you've never interrogated someone who tried to kidnap someone you care about." "Doesn't mean I can't handle this." Eli held his gaze. "We all care about Michaela." "We do." Rob lifted a brow. "But your heart's getting more involved than you care to admit." No reason to respond to his brother's comment. Nothing would stop him from questioning the man. Eli cocked his head towards the interrogation room. "I think we should get down to business, don't you?" Rob hesitated before he gave a nod. "Okay, let's go." When they entered the room, the would-be kidnapper leaned back in his chair and drummed his fingers on the metal table. "I'm Chief Superintendent Robert Carlton, and this is Senior Sergeant Eli Carlton. We know your name's Guy Mangione." The finger drumming stopped. His index finger poised above the table, then thudded down as he resumed drumming. "I know who you are." "Great, then we can get right to it." Rob sat across from the shackled man. There was a chair for Eli as well, but he opted to stand, his blood too hot to let him sit still. If Mangione knew who they were, he'd know the Carltons and the White League had a history. By apprehending this man, were they one step closer to finding who was responsible for murdering their father? He folded his arms. "Did Carl Horsburden commission you to kidnap Michaela?" Mangione locked both hands behind his head and leaned back until he'd lifted the front legs of his chair off the cement floor. A smirk parted his mustache and beard and broke his hardened features. "Wrong, right out of the gate. I'm not working for Carl." Eli's brow lowered, and then he braced both hands on the table, bending so close he smelled the creep's hot breath. "Ugh. Who are you working for, then?" "Someone much more powerful." Mangione dropped the front legs back on the floor and wagged a finger. "Someone a lot closer to what happened to the other member of your family who got too nosy." Heat flared in Eli's chest. He slammed his fist on the table. "Who? Johannes?" Rob was on his feet in a flash, grabbing Eli's arm. He directed him towards the door. "Eli, let's step outside." Eli struggled at first, but complied. Having an altercation with his brother in front of this man wouldn't be professional. Once in the hall, he inhaled and folded his arms. "I was afraid of this happening." Rob narrowed his eyes. "You didn't last 2 minutes before your emotions got the better of you. You have to be tactful during questioning. You're far too emotionally involved to do that right now." "Of all the... I've never been too emotional to do my job." Rob's steady gaze didn't waver. "There's no shame in being passionate.
You're angry these men took Dad from us and are after Michaela, but you can't let your emotions get in the way of good policing. There's nothing wrong with stepping back and leaving this to others. It doesn't mean you care any less about Dad or Michaela or putting an end to the White League. We have to do what's best for the case's progress. Eli rubbed the back of his neck, his taut muscles clenching up further. Rob was right. He hadn't kept his feelings under control. He'd get kicked off the case if he kept going. Squaring his shoulders, he cleared his throat. I'm sorry. It won't happen again. No more outbursts, I promise. Let's go back in. Rob studied him for several seconds. All right, but if it happens again, I won't hesitate to have you removed. Eli stopped before the glass, eyeing the man within, and breathed in and out before facing Rob. What was wrong with him today? He prided himself on years of controlling his emotions. Understood, brother. Understood. He clapped him on the back. Come on, let's get this dude. When they re-entered the room, Eli allowed Rob to take the lead. Despite his promise, he couldn't guarantee he wouldn't lose his cool again. Tension still smouldered inside him like a fire that hadn't been fully extinguished. He couldn't risk letting it burst into flames. Displaying the same calm with which he approached every situation, Rob sat and surveyed Mangione. We left off talking about who you're working for. If it wasn't Carl who sent you, who was it? Scoffing, Mangione rolled his eyes upwards and folded his beefy arms. I don't have to tell you nothing. Nodding, Rob rested his arms on the table. I'll make this simple. You can go to prison like Carl and await trial, not knowing whether you'll ever roam free again. Or you can help us with the information we need, and we can see about cutting you a deal. The choice is yours. Mangione glanced at Eli before his gaze returned to Rob. The information I have is worth more. I'll only tell you if you get me off the hook altogether. Shaking his head, Rob chuckled. I can't promise that. Only that we'll cut you a deal. Mangione lifted his shackled hands. Then we have nothing to talk about. Guess you're right. Rob stood. I'll tell my deputy to lock you up. Eli knew his brother well and wasn't surprised when his tactics elicited a reaction. Okay, wait, Mangione said. Rob turned, his brow rising. Changed your mind? A growl issued from Mangione's throat. I'll tell you what you want to know, but I am not going to prison. Rob shrugged. Tell us what you know, and we'll see what we can do. No promises. Refuse to talk, and you'll be locked away for sure. Eli's heart pounded. They were so close to the information they needed. Finally, Mangione spoke. I don't work for Carl. I work for his old man, Johannes. A shiver shot up Eli's spine. They'd known Pure Light and the White League were closely intertwined, but having it confirmed that Michaela's hunter was the group's legendary leader chilled his core. Why does he want Michaela? Rob asked. Carl seems to be the religious one, and she was a member of Pure Light, not the White League. She's his niece. Mangione's lips twisted into a mocking smile. Rob leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. We both know the Horsburdens aren't an affectionate family. Tell us why he's putting so much energy into tracking her down. Mangione stared at him, the stubborn, hard expression returning. Eli threw his hands in the air and leaned closer to the creep. Just remember, whether or not we cut you a deal is dependent on how forthcoming you are about what you know. No information, no deal. When Mangione speared him with his gaze, Eli glared right back, barely managing to keep his anger under control. She has information Johannes doesn't want to get out. Mangione waved a hand. If she knows what's good for her, she'll keep quiet, but Johannes can't risk it. Eli's throat went dry. He'd seen this happen far too many times. An innocent person caught in the crossfire because of information he or she had never wished to obtain and possibly didn't know they had. Now Michaela had been placed in this situation.
Rob edged forward in his chair. "Tell Johannes to call off the search for her." Mangione almost choked on his laughter. "It wouldn't do any good. You should know better than anyone that Johannes doesn't take orders." Lava-hot heat swept through Eli. Reacting now would only get him thrown off the case. But he wasn't finished with this man. Or Johannes. Clenching his fists, he silently addressed the man he was now convinced had murdered his father. "Mark my words, Johannes Horsburden. I'm going to track you down and make you pay if it's the last thing I do." Chapter 7. Seated on Rob and Emma's couch, Michaela switched her gaze between Eli and Rob, her mouth falling open. I don't know what to say." The brothers studied her. They didn't believe her. A chill spread through her chest. "You must know what he's referring to." Rob cut a hand through the air. Guy Mangione pulled this out as his main bartering chip. There must be something to it. Michaela shifted on the couch and exhaled a long breath. "If I knew what he was talking about, I'd tell you. I have no idea." Rob shook his head and raked his fingers through his hair. "That doesn't make sense." Sure, he wasn't trying to insult her. Still, her chest tightened at his insistence. "I don't know anything. If I did, don't you think I'd tell you?" "She's right, Rob." Eli'd remained silent throughout the conversation, but now the understanding in his expression caused her eyes to sting. She let her tight shoulders inch down from her ears and kept her focus on him. Thank you, God. Yes, she needed that. She needed someone to believe in her, support her, especially now with the attacks still so fresh. "Mangione might have said this to scare us," Eli remarked, his voice low. "And to scare Michaela. Remember what kind of men we're dealing with. People like him will say whatever serves them best." Rob ran a hand over his jaw. His gaze swung back to her. "I'm sorry. I thought we'd gotten such a big scoop and what he'd told us would help us piece everything together." She managed a small smile. "I understand. I appreciate everything you're doing, and I only wish I could do something to help." Her heart did a flip when she caught Eli watching her. Their gazes met and held. That he had her back assured her she'd be okay, but as much as she was telling herself that's all it was, she also knew she was developing feelings for him. Feelings she welcomed and sensed might be reciprocated. But the situation was growing more serious, and Eli and Rob needed clear heads. She couldn't let herself be a distraction for either of them, especially for Eli. Rob pushed to his feet and paced, seemingly deep in thought. Finally, he stopped in front of Eli. "Regardless of any discrepancies in the information Guy Mangione gave us, I'm willing to bet he was serious about Johannes's determination to find Michaela." "I agree." Eli rubbed between his eyes. "We can't ignore such a threat. We need to find a new safe house since Johannes's men can easily search all the Carlton households. She can't stay here." A shiver ran up Michaela's spine. She was putting his family in harm's way. She didn't remark on it, however, as they'd only remind her their jobs often entailed danger and it wasn't her fault. "We need somewhere inconspicuous." Eli tapped his cheek with a finger. "A place where even the property owners don't know she's in danger." Rob paced to the fireplace. Snapping his fingers, he pointed in his brother's direction. "I've got it. The bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town. It's off the beaten track and is used by vacationers and honeymooners. It's small with only a few rooms." Eli cocked his head. "That sounds unassuming enough." Michaela frowned. "But if it's small and used for vacationers, wouldn't it look suspicious having a guard standing watch?" Rob folded his arms, his brows furrowed. "Good point. Your protector will have to become part of the ruse."
I'll be her guard.
I thought you wanted to help track down Johannes. Rob lifted a brow. Conflicted emotions crossed Eli's countenance. She dropped her gaze to her hands to hide the inevitable redness of her cheeks. Was there? There was more to his determination to stay by her side than simply doing his job, wasn't there? Her heartbeat skittered into faster speed.
Since I've been involved in protection so far, it's best if I stick close to her.
Rob hesitated before giving a nod. I can't think of anyone I'd trust more for the job. Neither could she.
We'll need to come up with a believable story about what we're doing there, Eli said.
The place is too small to take up 2 rooms for an extended time, Rob mused. When he spoke again, his voice was hesitant. I have an idea, but I'm not sure you'll like it. Michaela and Eli exchanged glances.
What is it?
She asked. Rob licked his lips. Just hear me out, okay? What if you pretended to be honeymooners? Then Eli would be able to stay in the same room, and no one would realize he's your guard. Everyone would expect you to be together. Honeymooners? Michaela's mouth fell open. She shifted uneasily on the couch. Her hands grew clammy despite the overhead fan flinging cool air on her. She didn't want to sound ungrateful, but this plan could be problematic. Could she trust Eli to honor her? Ouch! How dare she think like that? The Carltons had been raised well. Just because his trust wasn't in the Lord didn't mean he was devoid of morals. He must have been reading her mind because he said, I promise nothing untoward will happen. She blinked.
Oh, I wasn't.
He raised a hand, stopping her with a gentle shake of his head.
I understand your reservations, which is why I want to reassure you this is all business.
Heat crept up her neck again.
I didn't mean to infer otherwise.
There's no need to feel bad. Rob reached over and patted her knee. None of this is ideal, and if you're uncomfortable, we can think of something else. Keenly aware, she'd just wished there was something she could do to help. She shook her head.
I trust you both. Tell me the plan.
Rob sat on a chair across from her. We'll say you're visiting from Melbourne, you're newlyweds and wanted somewhere not too far from home for your honeymoon while still feeling like you're on vacation. You'll wear wedding bands and act like your honeymooners. He watched them both closely. I'm not suggesting you do anything that would make either of you feel awkward. You need to be convincing, though. She had no trouble being friendly with Eli. But what would such a charade do to her heart? She'd need to be careful not to let her emotions run away with her. That slippery slope would be all too easy to tumble down with a man as handsome as Eli pretending to be her husband.
We can handle it, Rob.
She jutted up her chin.
I want to make things as easy as possible for you, so tell me what I need to do.
Rob gave a grateful nod. Hopefully it won't be for long, just until we track down Johannes. We'll work on the details. She took a deep breath.
I'm thankful to have people like you looking out for me.
She glanced at Eli, who quickly lowered his gaze, but not before she saw the vulnerability in his eyes. He wasn't as tough as he made out. I'll make the arrangements and we'll get you moved in tomorrow. Rob pushed to his feet.
You mean we'll arrive for our honeymoon?
Michaela chuckled in an attempt at lightness. Rob chuckled as well. Yes, for your honeymoon. The moment their conversation ended, every ounce of strength drained from her body, leaving her fighting to keep her eyes open.
I think I'll head to bed.
It's been a trying few days, Eli replied with understanding. She headed towards the stairs, but turned back before going up.
Thanks again for everything you're doing.
He regarded her, his gaze steady. I'll be on watch tonight. Rest easy.
Thank you.
Her heart pounded as she made her way upstairs. As tired as she was, Sleep would be anything but peaceful tonight with tangled thoughts of safe houses and honeymoon disguises, then Mangione, Johannes, Carl, and Eli Carlton weighing on her. The following morning, Michaela wrapped a towel around her shoulders as Holly readied the platinum blonde hair dye that would be part of her disguise. "Just looking at this stuff makes me feel rebellious," Holly joked. "Isn't this what girls do when they want to rebel against their parents?" Michaela laughed. "Yes, although I didn't feel the need to." Holly's expression grew wry. "I did. I was into anything questionable. Always putting myself out there, trying new things, getting into trouble." Michaela tipped her head. "I sensed that when I first met you at the commune. It took a lot of courage to sneak into Pure Light as an undercover reporter." She exhaled. "Now all of you are wrapped up in this mess." Holly reached over and gripped her arm, the plastic glove she wore crinkling. "Don't talk like that. We're all in this together. Now, let's get to this hair dye, shall we?" Though still not sold on the idea, Michaela nodded. She'd wondered if dyeing her hair was necessary. However, Rob, adamant that every precaution be taken, was quick to assure her it was best to disappear as much as she could. She'd not dyed her hair before. She loved the natural russet she'd inherited from her mother, but on even a small chance to make it harder for her uncle's men, she'd do it. Although nothing was fun about their reasons for dyeing her hair, a great deal of hilarity filled the process as they behaved like young girls experimenting with their hair for the first time. But all mirth left Michaela when she saw her reflection. The finished product produced the desired effect. She looked so different, not herself. Holly placed her hands on her shoulders and caught her reflected gaze in the mirror. "Are you okay?" Michaela nodded. "I'm just being silly. It took me by surprise, that's all." Holly turned her and looked straight into her eyes. "Feelings are never silly. Tell me." Michaela ran her fingers through her hair and shrugged. "I don't feel like myself. It's like I don't even know who I am anymore." Tears pooled in her eyes. "Oh, honey." Holly embraced her, pressing their cheeks together. "I know this is hard. I can't tell you how difficult it was for me to sneak into Pure Light and to tell Carl and Sally I was someone I wasn't, then convince them I believed something I didn't." She stepped back and shook her head. "But it was my choice. In your case, you have no option but to assume a new identity. Your life depends on it." Michaela wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't want to seem like I'm complaining. It could be so much worse, but it all seems surreal. Sometimes I feel like I'm watching someone else's life unfold." "Anyone would experience a little of that if they were to walk in your shoes." Holly paused before leaning closer to Michaela. "Can I tell you what helps me when I'm unsure of my identity?" Always grateful for this woman's godly wisdom, Michaela nodded. "Yes, please." "Well, 1 John 3 tells us we're children of God, and Colossians 3 verse 3 reminds us Christ died for us and we're now hidden in Him. He's our hiding place. No matter how conflicted we feel about our identity in this world, we can feel pulled in a million different directions, but God's view of us never changes. We can always trust that we're safe and known and loved by Him." A weight lifted off Michaela's shoulders. What a wonderful reminder. She gripped her friend's hands and smiled. "Thank you." Holly tugged her in for another hug before surveying Michaela's hair. She reached out and fluffed it. "It's different, but blonde isn't a bad color on you." Michaela laughed and glanced in the mirror. "You think so?" "Absolutely. It'll just take some getting used to, that's all." Michaela wondered what Eli might think, but then pulled herself up. She couldn't let herself go down that path. although his opinion had come to matter more with each passing day despite her attempts to suppress her growing feelings. Fortunately, Holly was too wrapped up in rummaging in her jewelry box to notice Michaela's inner conflict. She returned with a sterling silver ring. "You can't pass as newlyweds without one of these." Michaela chuckled.
"I guess you're right."
She slipped the band onto her ring finger and stared at it as another thought crossed her mind. What would it be like to wear Eli's wedding band for real? She shook the thought away.
"Stop it. You know the danger of letting your thoughts go down this path."
"Rob and Eli should be here soon. Why don't we go downstairs and wait for them over a cup of tea?" Although Michaela agreed, her stomach churned. How could she protect her heart and keep her mind pure when she would be so close to Eli, day and night? Maybe this was a bad idea, but it had gone too far to back out now.
"Lord, help me keep my focus and trust on you at all times. Let my thoughts remain pure and pleasing in your sight, and please help the team find Johannes and keep them safe."
By the time the men arrived, and she and Eli needed to leave, she felt more at peace, although her heart ticked over as he stood at the door and their gazes met. He wore glasses, and his hair was darker and combed flat. He looked handsome and sophisticated, but although his outward appearance had changed, his brown eyes were warm and would have melted into hers if she hadn't averted her gaze. Chapter 8. Eli glanced at Michaela as he pulled up outside the bed and breakfast in the hired car Rob had organized. He'd expected her to be on edge. Maybe she was, but she appeared calm, while he, an anti-terrorist professional, felt utterly discomposed.
"Are you ready for this?"
He winced at the edge to his voice. Nodding, she tossed a smile over her shoulder as she opened the door and climbed out. He unloaded their bags from the boot. When she offered to carry her own, he objected. It was easier if his hands were full so he didn't have to decide whether he should hold her hand. Although, at some stage, he would have to, wouldn't he? The quaint cottage with a thriving garden and a picturesque lawn must seem ideal for real honeymooners. Shaking his head, he tried not to stomp up the steps. The proprietress smiled from the front desk when they entered the reception area.
"Welcome. You must be Mr. and Mrs. Thornton."
Eli wasn't a stranger to assuming another identity for work purposes. However, having Michaela referred to as his wife would take some getting used to, and his voice faltered.
Yes, Mrs. Langley. How are you?"
"Just fine,"
the grey-haired woman bubbled. She looked between them, her expression knowing, her blue eyes twinkling.
"I've made sure the honeymoon suite is all ready for you, lovebirds. Nothing but the best for newlyweds around here."
Michaela smiled sweetly.
"Thank you. How kind."
How did she do that? Just slip right into the role. He stood back with the luggage as she fell into easy conversation with the woman who led them upstairs. Meanwhile, his awkwardness was nearly as remarkable as the way his emotions had been conflicting with his work of late. He bumbled behind her, trying not to scratch the soft mint stairwell with toggles on the duffel bags. He needed to figure out what was going on since he had a job to do, and he couldn't let his heart get in the way, not when Michaela's safety was at stake.
"You two have the best view in the whole house if you want my opinion."
Mrs. Langley placed her hands on her plump hips as she nodded to the large picture window. Eli placed the bags on the luggage holder before crossing the polished timber floor to look out. He swept aside the filmy curtain and braced a hand on the mint and rose wallpaper beside the window. The house where 2 agents would be staying was just visible through the trees.
"It's a great room, Mrs. Langley,"
Michaela offered her sincere smile. The woman beamed.
"So glad you like it. Dinner is served downstairs at 6 p.m, unless you two would prefer to have a tray sent up here so you can be alone."
Michaela waved a hand.
No, that's all right. We'd love to join you. See you at 6.
Once alone, she turned to face Eli.
I hope you don't mind me saying we'd go for dinner. I thought it might seem more natural.
Eli cleared his throat.
That's fine. You're doing a great job keeping up the front.
She shrugged, hesitating before reaching for her duffel bag.
I guess I'll get unpacked. I'll take the drawers on the left. You take the ones on the right?
Yeah, that's fine. Seriously, what was wrong with him? Now he was acting like a tongue-tied schoolboy. Why was this arrangement unsettling him so much? He reached for his bag, grateful to have a task. I have to say, you're doing a lot better pulling off this disguise than I am. Michaela angled her head, big eyes blinking at him.
You're having trouble with it?
A mirthless chuckle rasped against his throat. Just a little. Her expression softened.
It's because of all the responsibility, that's all. I'm sure there's so much on your mind.
His heart overflowed with appreciation for her kindness. He accepted the cover and nodded. I guess that's it. Despite her words, he wouldn't be able to rely on her to make this disguise work forever. He needed to get his head in the game. He had a job to do. The day passed. They'd each brought their own things to occupy their time. She'd brought a book and some crossword puzzles. He'd brought his notes from the case. Notes he'd studied ad infinitum. Bent over them, spread out on the antique desk. He tried to narrow his focus on the words as a soft breeze drifted the filmy curtains inward. There had to be some clue to where Johannes was. He lifted his head, rubbing between his eyes. A headache was starting. He had not known how difficult being in a room all day with Michaela would be. Her very presence distracted him, and he kept glancing at her. She was so breathtakingly gorgeous as she relaxed on the brocaded lounge, reading, the scent of her freshly washed platinum hair tickling his nostrils. Although he liked the colour, he preferred her natural russet. The warmer tones suited her better. Finally, it was time to go downstairs for dinner. Man, her green dress showed off her trim figure. Not that he was looking. Heading to the bedroom door behind her, he averted his gaze to the floor as he tucked his crisp, white shirt into his jeans. He shut the door behind himself. When he took her hand as they walked down the timber stairs, she smiled at him. They'd discussed how they should act in public, but he wasn't prepared for the way his heart raced at the touch of her skin. He swallowed hard. Protecting her might prove easier than protecting his heart. 3 other couples were already seated in the dining room. Thankfully, they each had their own tables and only had to nod and smile, not engage in small talk. Mrs. Langley brought out a lovely meal on delicate bone china, and flavourful steam curled from the roast chicken and vegetables with a thick, tempting gravy. Michaela couldn't finish the huge serving. He had no trouble, though he lingered over it, not wanting to leave the dining room. Eating helped fill the time and the awkward silences, although every now and again, when they met each other's gazes and a blush crept up her cheeks, it almost felt like they were newlyweds. Long after dinner, he sat alone by the bedroom window and peered out through the curtain. Although he wouldn't have been good company, it might have been better to have accepted Mrs. Langley's invitation for after-dinner coffee downstairs. If they had, he wouldn't have to sit here with Michaela. She wasn't doing anything other than reading her Bible on the bed, but her presence disturbed him. He watched her reflection on the glass window. She looked so peaceful and at ease. If only picking up the book she held would give him that same restfulness. When she shut her eyes, her lips moving slightly, he found it impossible to look away. He studied her serene face until she opened her eyes again and looked straight at him. Their gazes meeting on the window. He tore his away, embarrassed at being caught staring.
Something wrong?
Her brow crumpled, and genuine concern tightened her voice. "Nothing's wrong." He shook his head and faced her. "I was just wondering." She closed her Bible and settled against the headboard. "Wondering what?" He swallowed hard. "Remember the other night when we were all eating together at Mum's table?" Her brow scrunched a little more, but surely that was confusion, not fear, as she nodded. He ran a hand over his hair. It wasn't too late to keep quiet, but something spurred him on, despite the vulnerability of doing so. "I looked around at everyone and realized each person believed the God they prayed to was there listening. And he cared. I wondered then what that was like. Just now, when I saw you praying, I asked myself that question again." The open compassion on her face was almost more than he could bear. His throat grew tight. Perhaps being this transparent with her wasn't wise. "Trusting God isn't an easy thing." Her gaze moved beyond him to the window, her expression stilling. "When Carl and Sally brought me into pure light, trusting in the things they said about God, that he has a divine plan for us and so on, took so much effort." Her lips twitched. Even in the light of the heavy topic, Eli couldn't help thinking about how perfectly formed they were. "As you know, the doctrine presented within the cult is far from biblical." She waved a hand. "They said God has a purpose for each of us, to continue the line of white supremacy to preserve a superior race. I did believe initially, but it was hard to trust. They're two separate things." She looked at him then, her gaze steady. "Later, when I came to know Christ as my personal savior and understood that he cared about me intimately, it didn't mean trust came easily." Something loosened inside him. He almost took a step forward as he whispered, "Really?" He'd always imagined everyone around him felt this magical peace that never went away. That something was wrong with him because he couldn't feel it too. "Really?" She nodded. "I still pray daily that God will give my heart rest in him. Just because I know he has my best interests in mind, and I know I'm saved, doesn't mean I don't struggle with trust." Turning away, he braced his hands on the windowsill and stared out. It was easier than looking at her. "I find it hard to believe he cares when he's allowed such terrible things to happen. I don't understand, and that makes it hard for me to trust." Silence hung in the air before the bed squeaked, and Michaela joined him at the window. Keenly aware of her petite frame beside him, he kept his gaze steady. "I've asked myself those same questions." Her words fogged the glass below, where the steam from his was fading. "I can't tell you how many times I've wondered why God allowed my parents to be taken away from me during the years I needed them most. I've questioned why he's allowed a misleading cult like Pure Light to convolute his word and to destroy so many people's lives." She angled her head upwards. "Do you want to know what I do when these questions won't leave me alone?" He hesitated before nodding. "I remember what the Bible says about God working all things together for good for those who love him." She returned to the bed and grabbed her Bible, flipping through the pages as she came back. "This is what I was just reading. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And then another passage. This was just before Jesus was betrayed. Here, he knew what lay before him as he said to his disciples, "You don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will." She lifted her gaze to his. "God understands our human tendencies to question and to want to know why. One day we'll know why, but in the meantime, if we understand who he is, we'll be able to trust that he does have everything under control, and he does care about us, but he sees a bigger picture than what we do." Eli's heart twisted. He'd been angry at God for so long, even blaming him for his father's death. But Michaela's humbly spoken words struck a chord within him. He'd never allowed himself to think that perhaps God did care what happened to him. He'd always assumed he didn't because of what had been taken away from him. He barely managed to speak around the lump in his throat.
When trusting is hard, where do you start?
Compassionate understanding softened her delicate features.
Where you can. God doesn't scold us for struggling. All we need to say is, Lord, I don't understand this, but please show me how to give it to you. He'll do it, Eli. Our faith might waver at times, but when it does, we can get right back on our knees and talk to him about it once again. He wants to hear from us, no matter what state we're in.
Suddenly exhausted, he let his shoulders sag. He'd been running non-stop for years, striving to make everything, revenge, justice, peace, happen all on its own. Had his efforts all been in vain? He looked at Michaela, amazed once again by the light radiating from her countenance. He wanted to share in this. But how? I want to believe. He pushed the words past the tightness in his throat and chest. But how could he explain? I'm afraid of being disappointed. What if God doesn't come through? She finished, her voice solemn. He dropped his gaze to the floor and nodded. Placing her hand on his shoulder, she turned him to face her.
Eli, look at me.
It took all his strength to meet her gaze. Once he did, the confidence in her eyes left him vulnerable and assured at the same time. When she spoke again, it was with renewed fervency.
He'll come through. It might not always be in the way you want him to, but it will always be for the best.
Emotion spilled from her eyes.
I can see you're burdened. Jesus said, Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest.
She touched his cheek.
Stop carrying the burden on your own. You were never meant to shoulder it by yourself.
All he could hear was his pounding pulse. Could letting go of this hatred that had been eating at him for so long be so close, so accessible? She pulled back her hand, blushing.
Sorry.
He shook his head. Don't be sorry. I'm the one who should be sorry for dumping all that on you right now. But thanks for talking about it. She breathed in slowly.
You'll find your way. Just be willing to open your heart to God and then let him do his part.
Hadn't his brother said something similar? Straightening his shoulders, he managed a return smile. Thank you. An awkward silence followed before she chuckled.
So, about the sleeping arrangements?
He crossed to the wardrobe and produced a spare blanket and pillow from the shelf inside. I'll sleep on the couch, no problem. Her brows scrunched.
Are you sure?
Absolutely. She shrugged.
Okay.
He grabbed his wash bag and headed towards the adjoining bathroom. Once the door was shut, he inhaled and leaned on the sink, struggling with what to do with these emotions. The irresistible desire to take what Michaela had said and run with it was strong. But after doing everything on his own for years, surrendering that also felt like an insurmountable feat. He brushed his teeth and washed his face before changing into pajama pants and a t-shirt. He nodded to Michaela as they traded places. By the time she returned, he was settled on the couch, but far from ready for sleep. Her large flannel pajamas swallowed up her slim frame. She'd probably picked night clothes to disguise her form. Grateful for this, he laced his hands behind his head and peered at the slow ceiling fan. She was already terribly distracting without even trying.
Ready for me to turn off the light? She asked.
Sure. He shifted his pillow in an attempt to get comfortable. He felt around the side table to make sure his pistol was within reach and glanced at the door, ensuring it was locked. Good night.
Good night, she replied. He listened as she settled down in bed before the room went silent. He'd just closed his eyes when she spoke. Eli? Yes? Could I pray for you? The tightness in his throat once again threatened to choke him. At least the darkness concealed his turmoil. Sure, I guess that would be all right. Great. She paused before she began. Lord, I know you've been a part of our discussion tonight. You know our struggles better than either of us ever could. She paused again for so long, Eli thought the prayer was complete. When she did continue, the tenderness in her voice tugged at his heart and brought tears to his eyes. Be with Eli tonight. Bring comfort and peace to his thoughts. Show him you're there to share his burden. He's done so much for me and the rest of the family, Lord. He deserves a rest. He swallowed hard, battling the threatening tears. How was it he could stand up to the worst of society, yet a single prayer could break through every one of his defences? When he was sure he could speak without sounding tearful, he thanked her and listened to her say he was welcome. Silence stretched between them as he was left alone with his thoughts. He turned her words over in his mind, wrestling with the idea of surrender, until, eventually, sleep came. Chapter 9. When Mrs. Langley told Michaela about a village church nearby, she was hesitant about mentioning it to Eli. He'd turned down her invitation to attend a church service before, but if she went alone, it might arouse suspicion. After all, they were meant to be acting like a happy newlywed couple, not a bickering one. After some deliberation, she asked him since the thought of not attending church made her heart sink, especially as they had no idea how much longer they'd need to stay. She was pleasantly surprised when he agreed. Sure, it could be good to go, all things considered. It was dangerous to read too much into his response, but she couldn't help hoping their conversation the other night had planted a seed. Perhaps the prayers she'd been offering on his behalf since they met were being answered and his heart was opening to God's love. Their first newlywed Sunday dawned clear and beautiful. The fresh air and bright blue sky had her in the best mood since her almost kidnapping. Plus, the prospect of being under one roof with the other believers gave her remarkable energy. She couldn't help admiring the pressed dress shirt Eli wore. He always looked handsome, but his church attire was dashing. She said a little prayer, knowing it would be difficult to keep her mind on the sermon when he looked the way he did, especially with those glasses making him appear so mysterious and sophisticated. Through breakfast, they managed to keep up their newlywed facade. It seemed to be getting easier with each day. Before they set out on the short walk to church, there'd been no sign of Johannes's men, although that could change at any time. Eli appeared constantly alert, and even as they held hands and chatted, he was on duty. Folks mingled out front as they approached. Their voices and chatter warmed Michaela, but as she glanced at Eli, her heart went out to her uncomfortable-looking escort. How long had it been since he'd attended a church service? Months? Years? She squeezed his hand. Should we go in? He gave an unconvincing smile. Sure. Inside they took a seat in one of the middle pews, and she tried not to keep peeping at him, even though it was strange to see this self-assured man look out of place. At least he'd been willing to attend. The pastor stepped to the pulpit. The middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, Russell, as Mrs. Langley had told her, smiled at the congregation as he opened his Bible. Aren't you a great-looking crowd today? Good-natured chuckles rippled through the sanctuary. I'm always grateful to share Sunday mornings with you all. He looked down at his Bible. I don't claim to know what you've all been dealing with this week or what state you've arrived in today. However, May I be so bold as to suggest that, on some level, we're all here for the same reason? Any guesses as to what that reason might be? Pews creaked as the congregation made guesses. Pastor Russell studied them before answering his own question. Forgiveness. Though she kept her gaze forward, Michaela sensed Eli tense beside her. Lord, please open his heart. I know you've brought us both here today for a reason. Please speak to him today in the way only you can. Pastor Russell leaned forward, resting his elbows on the pulpit. His casual posture made him appear like a grandfather figure about to impart wisdom rather than a pastor she'd never met. I'm guessing most of you, no matter how much time you've spent in church, have heard of the forgiveness God offers. You know, in our culture, the idea of people getting what they deserve is glorified, isn't it? Murmured agreement filled the room. The phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is actually biblical. Pastor Russell's gaze moved along them, but it's important to notice context. Does anybody know where it appears? Old Testament, a man in the front row called out. Pastor Russell pointed at him. Exactly. This was in a time when people's wrongdoings were penalized according to their crime. The phrase is still often quoted today, and our modern judicial systems still use this guiding principle when determining a penalty. Revenge and justification were, and are, the overriding objectives. Forgiveness rarely gets a look in. No longer bracing on his elbows, he stepped back from the pulpit. We are all wrongdoers, guilty before God. The Bible says, all are sinners and fall short of God's glory. He has every right to dole out the punishment we deserve, and yet, he loved us so much that he sent his perfect Son, Jesus, to die on the cross, paying the penalty for our sins. Just as God forgave us, we are also told to forgive those who trespass against us. Michaela held her breath, feeling Eli growing increasingly uncomfortable. She wanted to reach out and grab his hand, to reassure him somehow. But she dare not smother him, so she resisted. Continuing to pray, he'd venture past his discomfort and allow the words to penetrate his soul. While we can't allow murderers and thieves to go free, if we harbor unforgiveness in our hearts, anger and bitterness will find root and grow. There's no need for personal vendettas, regardless of how wronged we might feel. Let the law and God do their work. Jesus said, do not judge, and you will not be judged. And do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. A spirit of forgiveness will release you from a hard and bitter heart. I understand how difficult this can be, especially when you believe you're in the right, and yet, when Jesus hung on that cross, what did he say? The pastor glanced at the wooden cross above the baptistry. He said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Eli stood to his feet. Michaela didn't even have enough time to reach out to him before he was out of the pew and headed towards the exit. Heart pounding, she followed him. It didn't work, Lord. Her heart heavy, she hurried from the sanctuary. I thought maybe today would be the day he'd come to understand and let go of the pent-up anger. God, was I wrong to suggest we come here? Once outside, she looked frantically around. Eli was leaning against a nearby oak, his back to her. She sprinted to him, already planning out a speech about being glad he'd tried church and it being all right for them to head back to the bed and breakfast. But she stopped, stunned. Tears were streaming down his cheeks. Eli? She murmured, her heart breaking. He turned his head away and swiped at his cheeks. It was stuffy in there. She braced a palm against the sturdy trunk. I don't think that's why you're out here all alone. Are you all right? He cleared his throat. Of course. Gauging her words, she took a tentative step towards him. I know you're used to being strong, but it's okay not to be. Fresh tears filled his eyes. Reaching out, she wrapped her arms around him.
He tensed, then accepted her embrace. They remained that way until she pulled back and searched his face.
What was it the pastor said that affected you?
He folded his arms and blinked. She could only imagine how embarrassed he felt about his candid display.
That there's no need for personal vendettas, regardless of how wronged you might feel.
He blew out a breath.
It was like he was talking directly to me.
Her heart kicked up a hopeful tempo.
He did hear you, Lord. Is this the breakthrough his family has been praying for? The one I've been praying for? The idea of trusting God is hard.
His rough voice seemed to catch in his throat.
But I've been allowing hate and bitterness to drive me. I want whoever killed Dad to pay. But I've let it get too personal. I can't handle carrying that hate anymore. It's destroying me.
Her heart aching for him, she rubbed his arm.
Remember how he talks about starting wherever you can?
She smiled as he nodded.
The realization you've just reached is the perfect place to start.
He sucked in a jagged breath.
I don't know if I can.
Praying for the right words, she went on.
Would you do something for me?
When he met her gaze, he looked so vulnerable, and compassion surged through her.
I'd do anything for you, Michaela.
Her eyes widened before she blinked. No, he couldn't mean that. He meant he'd do anything to protect her.
I know you would.
She swallowed hard.
You've proven it over and over again. But what I'm asking you to do is for you. Would you try reading my Bible? Just a chapter a day or however much you feel able to read. If it doesn't help, fine. But give it a try, because I believe the Lord speaks to our hearts when we seek Him. He meets those who search for Him. Will you do it?
He searched her face.
Okay, I'll give it a try.
Relief whooshed out of her lungs, and she squeezed his arm.
God will meet you, Eli. Trust me.
He looked deep into her eyes, and before she could suggest they return to the bed and breakfast, he pulled her into his arms. Her breaths came faster as she leaned into him. Unsure of what was happening, she said nothing.
Lord, please keep Eli in your care and open his heart. And please protect mine.
Chapter 10. Though he was never off his guard, Eli began to relax as the days went on. He found himself better able to trust the 2 additional guards looking out for them than feeling he had to be on high alert. Was this what it felt like to begin trusting God? There was a freedom to it he hadn't expected. Just as Michaela asked him to, he'd been reading her Bible each day. Nothing had struck him with the force of the Sunday service. But he became more open to verses that simply used to be words on pages. Despite the subtlety, he'd begun to believe there was something to what Michaela had said. God met those who searched for him. Near the end of their first week, she suggested they take a walk. Enjoying the picturesque landscape sounded great. Besides, he was growing restless staying inside, hiding away, although being with her wasn't a chore. While they strolled in companionable silence, her hand in his, warm air stirred her pale hair around her, carrying the sweet scent of the bottlebrush trees lining the path. Rainbow lorikeets screeched in the branches as they foraged for the nectar. As her hair brushed his arm, he almost rubbed his thumb across the back of her hand. How their interactions had changed. Though his breakdown and demonstration had been uncomfortable, it had dissolved a wall between them. They understood each other now, lending a deeper compatibility. A young couple with a toddler came towards them. The child broke away and chuckled as his father sprinted after him, sweeping him into his arms moments before he slipped down an embankment and into the creek below. So innocent, much like Michaela. although she was now more aware of the danger she was in. Growing fonder of her, Eli nearly let remarks about his feelings slip. He'd caught himself, but remembering he couldn't afford to demonstrate anything beyond protectiveness until he finished his job was getting harder. Her fingers rested so lightly in his, so comfortable. Adding to his suspicion, she might also be attempting to balance a growing attachment. She was a sweet woman by nature, making it difficult for him to tell. If she was developing feelings, she kept them in check remarkably well. He knew why. They were still divided in their beliefs. Although he was doing his best to seek God, keeping their distance was best until he was sure of his feelings towards the faith she held dear.
"It feels like we've been here for a long time, doesn't it?"
she remarked as they approached a shady park. "The days are starting to blur together," he agreed, "though I must say, I've never had an assignment like this." She tossed him one of her smiles that never failed to steal his breath away.
"I haven't been too much of a trial for you, then?"
"You're not a trial at all." A seriousness invaded his tone. He needed a subject change, fast.
"We've done a good job pretending to be married, haven't we?"
She chuckled.
"Does this mean I'm cut out for undercover work?"
He played along, brow rising. "I think, were you to enter the field, you'd be one of the best." She laughed, turning her attention back to their surroundings. Her expression sobered. "That's a serious face." She shook her head.
"I was thinking about Guy Mangione and the information he said I had."
Eli exhaled. "It sure would have been helpful if he'd given us more to work with." Knowing Michaela had been kept in the dark about most of the workings of Pure Light and the League, he'd refrained from questioning her during their time here. However, they'd grown close enough he could probe without being intrusive. "Are you sure you can't think of anything that would make you invaluable to your uncle? Anything at all?" Her hand slid from his, and she twisted a strand of hair around one finger.
"No. I mean, besides having lived among the cult members and knowing their ideologies, I can't think of any special information I gained."
He'd just opened his mouth to tell her it was all right, and he believed her when she halted.
"Oh my!"
Her hand flew to her mouth. He reached for her arm to balance her, her sudden paleness worrying him.
"What is it?"
She stared at him with enlarged eyes.
"I remember something that might be important."
He nodded, his mouth going dry.
"I heard Carl and Sally talking once about the farm ranch in Switzerland. They whispered about it like it was some secretive location. I thought it strange for them to talk about a place so far away, but sometimes they disappeared for weeks on end."
Eli's heart raced. That could be it. A destination of interest. A safety point, maybe. Her face had grown paler.
"That's what I was thinking."
He grabbed her elbow, turning them back towards the bed and breakfast. "You might be better at undercover work than we thought," he teased, though his tone remained serious. "I have a feeling you're onto something."
"Do you think it'll help you find Johannes?"
"We can't know for sure, but it warrants a call to my unit in Melbourne. We need everything we can get right now, so there's no time to waste." They'd almost reached the bed and breakfast when one of the agents watching out for them jogged up, stopping them. "You'll need to stay back." Eli pushed Michaela behind him, shielding her. "Why, what's going on?" "There's been an altercation at the house where Ben and I have been staying." "What? Is he all right?" Eli blinked. "He'll be okay, but he's been injured." "Did the attacker get away?" The agent nodded, his jaw taut. "But I'm sure they were Horsburden's men. We need to call for backup. His reinforcements won't be far behind." Eli hesitated. He didn't know this agent well, but he'd been assured the man knew the ins and outs. This wasn't a time to take chances. "All right, I'll go and call for reinforcements. Stay with Michaela and don't let her out of your sight." He was already headed back towards the bed and breakfast. "Oh, believe me, I won't," the agent called after him. Eli didn't feel quite right about leaving her behind. even with a qualified agent, but he pushed that fear aside, chalking it up to his growing protectiveness. They had to get back up, or they could all be in trouble. Chapter 11. The moment Eli sat in one of the impersonal hospital waiting room chairs, he got right back up to continue pacing. He stopped to look at the clock. After being shot by the imposter at the bed and breakfast, Michaela had been in surgery for over an hour, and still he'd heard nothing. After the men who'd attempted to kidnap her had been apprehended, his family had joined him at the hospital. He'd accepted their company, then insisted they go on their way because there was too much to do after what had just taken place. His mother and Holly refused to go, stating he shouldn't be alone at a time like this. He appreciated their concern, but would have preferred time alone to sort through his thoughts. After they ran out of things to talk about, he resumed pacing. How could this have happened? He'd done everything to keep Michaela safe. Mr. Carlton? Eli spun on his heel and hurried to meet with the doctor, arriving at the same time as his mother and Holly. The surgery's over? The doctor nodded. She pulled through the surgery. Eli's heart plummeted, but the doctor folded his arms. The prognosis isn't good. We were lucky to get the bullet out, but we can't tell how much damage it did until she wakes up. Damage! Bile rising to his mouth, Eli swallowed. What kind of damage? His mother slipped an arm around his waist. The doctor shifted his weight, his expression grave. When a bullet enters the head in the way this one did, there's a chance there'll be lasting repercussions, including possible memory or motor function impairments. We won't know until she's conscious and we're able to assess her condition. With his world spinning, it was a miracle Eli remained on his feet. When will she wake up? The doctor shrugged. Maybe in an hour, maybe in a week. With a wince, he laid a hand on Eli's shoulder. Welcome to the waiting game, son. I'm sorry I don't have better news for you. Eli inhaled, fighting to stay calm. It's all right. Do you know who her next of kin is? Was that a fist squeezing his insides? He pressed a hand against it. She doesn't have family. I'll be her contact. The doctor patted his shoulder and nodded to his mother and Holly. We're doing everything we can. Eli stared at the back of the doctor's long white coat as he strode down the sterile hallway. Then Eli dropped into the waiting room chair and covered his face with his hands. Lava-like heat exploded within him. How could you, God? I asked for your help. I tried to trust you. And this is what I get. Hands fisting, he rocked back and forth before he grabbed his phone. If God wouldn't take care of this, he would. Excusing himself, he walked outside and dialed a connection in the anti-terrorism unit. Mike, I need you to do some research. The Horsburden case. Sure. Hey, I heard what happened. Just tell me what you need. I'll do anything. Eli's free hand balled into another fist. I need you to look up large plots of land in Switzerland, farm ranches. Look into who owns them and let me know if any look shady. Johannes and his people are utilizing one as a stronghold. Find it. You're kidding. Eli rubbed the back of his neck. I wish I were. I'll get right on this, Eli. I appreciate it. Keep me updated. He rejoined his mother and Holly inside, but before he could sit back down, a scrub-clad nurse approached. Mr. Carlton, the doctor's cleared Michaela for one visitor. She's not responsive, and you'll have to keep it brief, but you're welcome to go to her. Half in anticipation, half in dread, with his heart jumping inside his chest, he nodded his gratitude. Thank you. He did his best to prepare as he strode towards Michaela's room, but his heart broke at the sight of her. Limp and frail, her small form almost blended into the hospital bed. Oxygen tubing pumping life into her while the lifelessness of her face beneath her head bandaging caused a cold pit to form in his stomach. He stepped closer. "Michaela, I'm so sorry." But his throat closed over the words, and she probably wouldn't have understood the choked sound if she'd heard him. Almost afraid to touch her, he crossed his arms and tucked his hands inward to keep from reaching out. Surely, with her so fragile, even the slightest disturbance might cause her to break. Every bit of him tense, as if he could fight this battle for her. He stood there for the longest time. Then he reached out and stroked her cheek. The softest skin he'd ever felt, plush like velvet, grazed his fingertips. He'd wondered for a long time what it would be like to caress her beautiful face. He'd never dreamed it would happen at a moment like this. He drew his hand back and sank into the chair by the bed, watching her, willing her to wake up. "Please, Michaela, it can't end like this. I won't let it." When she remained unresponsive, knots tightened things inside him, and fearsome heat burning against the entire situation welled up. God, how could you? She didn't do anything wrong. He pushed to his feet. He couldn't sit around watching her fight for her life. He'd find Johannes and finish this. He didn't have long to wait for a callback from headquarters. He'd just exited the hospital when his phone rang. The farm ranch had been located. He grilled Mike about every aspect, the discoveries they'd made about its inhabitants, their irregular visits, their keeping to themselves, their odd clothing, matched Carl and Sally. By the time Eli reached the bed and breakfast, he'd booked a flight to Switzerland. It would depart at 5 a.m., but he wouldn't sleep tonight anyway. He threw a few sets of clothes and toiletries into a duffel bag before slipping his Glock in alongside. Going off on his own without notifying anyone was against protocol, not to mention unsafe. But Michaela didn't deserve to be fighting for her life in a hospital room. It was time for Johannes to pay. Chapter 12. The flight to Switzerland was anything but restful, but at least, without phone access during the trip, he wasn't flooded with worried messages. He ground his teeth, willing the plane to travel faster. He needed to obtain a lead before they raised the alarm at his absence. Beyond the window, a blanket of clouds spread beneath the aircraft as the sky lightened. He rubbed his forehead, forcing the tension from his muscles. Maybe his actions could be considered reckless, but he couldn't sit around, waiting, while the man responsible was on the loose. Rather than going straight to a hotel upon arrival, he jumped into a rental car and turned towards the mountains and the ranch. He'd have to control himself since he wanted nothing more than to pounce on the place and arrest whoever inhabited it. But that would only lead to trouble. Plus, while doing this rogue, he had to be even more strategic. 2 hours later, his heart hammered as he maneuvered his rented Ford along the winding mountain road. With the ranch so isolated, it was little mystery how it had managed to remain a secret. The Alps rising around him offered no distraction. People came for honeymoons and vacations to glimpse them, but he'd come for one thing only: Johannes. If this was a dead end, he'd keep looking. He would finish this. Whatever it took to make the man pay for this second blow he'd inflicted on the Carlton family. By the time a rustic log cabin appeared in the distance, enough hate to shoot the first person he saw pulsed through Eli. He parked far away enough to keep his car hidden and conceal his presence for as long as possible. He forced himself to pause and take a deep breath as he opened the locked case he'd transported the gun in and strapped on his weapon belt. This was it. He couldn't afford to mess up. Ice-cold air cooled his cheeks as he clicked the car door shut. eased his gun from its holster, and scanned the property, then sprinted from tree to tree as he approached the cabin, patches of hardened snow crunching under his feet. He hunkered under a sweeping cedar, adrenaline pumping, and sent one final glance around before crouching to the building. There. He pressed his back against the wall as he listened for signs of habitation. Birds chirped. Wind rustled. A plane droned high above. Nothing sounded within. Inhaling, he leaned in to glance through a nearby window. No one. Glancing around to ensure he was still alone, he slipped around the corner to the wraparound front porch. Expecting to break in, he stilled when his hand turned the unlocked doorknob. Heart thudding, he lowered his gun, gripped it with both hands, and slipped inside. His eyes adjusted to his dim surroundings. With every piece of furniture made of solid oak, nothing offered creature comforts, so this must be used as a hideout. He edged towards the door leading to the cabin's one bedroom. Rumpled sheets had slid off one side of a cot. A water bottle overshadowed a grimy ashtray on the bedside table. Smoke lingered in the air. Someone had been here, recently. With precious few moments to ascertain the inhabitant's new location, he strode to the desk near the fireplace. Moving the gun to his left hand, he pulled out a stack of maps from the drawer. Red pen marks snaked out numerous routes. Kind of strange they were paper maps in this computer era. But the cult abstained from modern technology. These must belong to Pure Light leaders so they could track the White League's mission and smuggling routes. Eli's palms began to sweat. The maps indicated they were supporting the White League's diabolical efforts. He was about to slip the maps into his coat pocket when the cock of a gun broke the silence. A shiver shot up his spine as a voice spoke from the doorway. "And what do you think you're doing?" His heart pounding, Eli locked eyes with Johannes himself. He'd never come face to face with the man, but he'd seen enough pictures. From Johannes's look of recognition, he, too, had done his homework. Well, if it isn't a member of the Carlton brood." Eli raised his gun and aimed back at Johannes. In the flesh, Johannes shook his head, laughing, the reaction chillingly out of place during their standoff. "I don't think you want to be doing that." Eli's pulse raced. All sense of reason was slipping away, but he didn't care. He'd waited years to put a bullet in this man. "Oh, I think I do." Footsteps came from the back door. His chest tightened. Johannes's sneer grew as a second gunman inched forward, his weapon trained on Eli. Everything in Eli rebelled against reality. How had he been so absorbed in the maps he'd missed both men's approach? Johannes twitched his gun. "You shouldn't have come here, when your old man meddled with us. It didn't end well, did it? Now you're about to have the same ending." A heavy weight dragged Eli down. He'd been so sure setting off on his own was the best way to get the job done, but how wrong had he been? With no one watching his back, he'd put himself in an impossible situation. Isolated, with no backup. Cornered, with nowhere to turn. Lost, with no one knowing his whereabouts. He'd ruined his chance to execute justice. Nauseous, he swallowed down the rising bile. His hatred and desire for revenge had landed him here. He was a hothead, just as Rob had said. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry, Michaela." "You're cornered." Johannes stalked closer. "Nothing's stopping me from putting a bullet in you right now, so I suggest you put your gun down." Eli's gaze flickered towards Johannes's comrade. Unwavering, the man peered back. With no other choice, Eli set his gun on the desk behind him and raised his hands. Johannes nodded to his crony. "Tie him up." Emotionless, Eli stood there as the man secured his hands behind his back. then shoved him towards the windowless bedroom. He'd failed his father and Michaela. Her sweet face lingered in his mind as his captor shut the bedroom door, plunging him into darkness. Chapter 13. A machine's persistent beeping pulled Michaela from sleep. Her eyelids felt heavy. Managing to drag them open, she stared at the white ceiling. Where was she? Her finger twitched, and something tickled her arm. Huh? An IV drip was flowing into her vein. Her throat closed as a tangle of memories flooded back. Rob and Eli, the man grabbing her, the gun pressing into her back, her running, then searing pain.
God, I thought I was going to die, but you saved me. Thank you.
Michaela? She turned her head towards the voice. Rob. She managed a weak smile. Hi. He leaned forward, his brow furrowed. How are you feeling?
Tired.
No surprise there. You've been through a lot these past 3 days. 3 days? She blinked.
I've been asleep for 3 days.
You've been out ever since you went into surgery. She winced, registering the pain in the back of her neck.
My head hurts.
He laid a gentle hand on her arm. I wouldn't move around too much right now. Head injuries are dangerous, and you sustained a bad one. His eyes moistened. The doctor wasn't sure you were going to make it. She blinked again.
Really?
At the very least, he expected some brain damage. His grip tightened a fraction, and his voice shook. But here you are, talking to me. It's a miracle. Head injury? Surgery? 3 days? The words pounded with the pulsing in her head, but her eyelids began to droop. She opened them with a start.
Where's Eli? Is he all right?
Rob's face twisted. Cold curled in her stomach.
Rob, what is it?
He wasn't hurt. He patted her hand, quick to reassure her. But he's missing. Missing? Her brow scrunched. The whooshing in her head made it hard to think, to remember. Someone had been trying to get her into a van. Had they taken him?
What do you mean?
After you got out of surgery, he left without a word to anyone. Knowing my baby brother, it has something to do with the case. The cold welled inside her.
It's my fault. If it hadn't been for me...
Rob shook his head. There's no point in thinking that way. Eli does what he wants, and you know that. She did all too well. The chill froze into something solid and settled over her. She'd thought he was learning how to entrust God with the pain Johannes inflicted, but now...
Lord, please protect Eli. I don't know what I'll do if he gets hurt because of me.
Don't worry, we'll find him, Rob assured. You rest now. I'm going to let the doctor know you're awake. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. And I'll phone the family right away. We've all been praying for you.
Give them my love.
But as exhaustion crowded in, she wasn't sure whether she'd spoken aloud or not. She was half asleep before he left the room. Eli's face lingered in her mind until she drifted off. When Michaela woke again, she felt rested but disorientated. The stark hospital surroundings made it impossible to distinguish the time of day. But, with a slight lull in the hall, it might be evening. A figure by the bed moved into her vision.
Good evening, sleepyhead.
Hello.
Michaela smiled at Jean as she tried to push herself up.
What time is it?
Nearly 8 p.m. They're about to tell visitors to skedaddle. So I'm glad you woke up before I left. It's such a joy to see those pretty eyes of yours open again.
Emotion twisted in Michaela's chest. Jean looked endlessly motherly in her crocheted sweater, the scent of rose perfume lingering around her. tenderness softening her expression. Michaela pushed back tears.
Thank you. Is there any news of Eli?
Not yet.
Letting out a heavy sigh, Jean shifted in the seat.
That boy's tenacity has gotten him places, but it's also gotten him into trouble. Most of the time, he makes it through, but the White League isn't a force to be taken lightly. They've never been kind to the Carltons.
With emotions twisting her chest, Michaela fought the urge to scream, but Jean.
How are you staying so calm when he could be in so much danger?
Jean shrugged.
It's taken a lot of practice, but having a husband and sons all involved in dangerous work has been good training. I've learned to place all my concerns in God's hands. The situation with Eli is out of our control, so we have no choice but to entrust his safety to the Lord.
She was right, of course. Michaela drew in deep breaths, working on her heart.
It's just so hard,
she murmured.
I feel like he wouldn't be in this situation if it weren't for me. He's determined to make Johannes pay for what happened to your husband, and this isn't about me. But I can't help feeling partially responsible.
Jean's eyes narrowed.
You're wrong, you know.
Michaela's brow knit.
What do you mean? About what?
Smiling, Jean reached for her hand and squeezed it.
You're wrong about it not being about you. I know my sons better than anyone, and I've never seen Eli this way.
Michaela angled her head.
What way?
In love.
Air rushed from her lungs.
In love? With me?
Jean laughed.
Yes, with you. Is that so hard to believe?
Averting her gaze, Michaela let out a tight chuckle.
I guess not. It's just, we're in such different places in our lives.
She took a moment before continuing.
I do feel for him, but I don't want to be a distraction while he's searching for God.
Still holding Michaela's hand, Jean rubbed her thumb across the back of it.
I've seen that, Michaela.
Michaela turned her fingers to return her friend's clasp. Knowing she'd been so transparent disconcerted her, but speaking freely about her feelings was a relief.
I thought he was starting to reach out for God, but this rash decision makes me fear I was wrong.
Jean shook her head.
Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is a person's relationship with God. Trusting isn't going to come easily to Eli, no matter what. Just because he's chosen to handle this situation in his old manner doesn't mean those seeds haven't taken root. All we can do is pray he'll think back on those seeds wherever he is. No situation we get ourselves into can bar God from getting through to the deepest parts of our hearts.
I have to admit I've been doing more worrying than praying on his behalf,
Michaela confessed. Jean's hand tightened once again on hers.
It's not too late to change that. Why don't we pray for him right now?
That would be great.
Michaela managed a small smile as her throat closed over. She might have been incapable of speaking, but her heart clung to Jean's every word as they lifted Eli up in prayer.
Chapter 14. When hours began to tick by, Eli stopped trying to decipher the time of day or night. How long he'd remained locked in the bedroom, bound and helpless. This wasn't how he'd expected this mission to end. He'd failed. His chest tightened until breathing became difficult. During his time with Michaela in the bed and breakfast, he'd felt his heart softening towards the things of God, felt trust working its way back into his life. God, how did I end up here? He voiced the question in quiet desperation. The weight of it all pressing so heavily on his shoulders, he wasn't sure he could take it any longer. He drew his knees to his chest. Tears sprang to his eyes, not out of fear for his own life or of never being found. They were mourning that he'd resorted to this rage-driven solution. He'd fallen prey to his demons once again. He longed to be by Michaela's side,
gaining strength from her calm confidence in the Lord. He'd started to believe there was something to this confidence, yet he'd acted rashly and taken things into his own hands again. Would he never learn? He lowered to his knees. "I'm sorry, Lord. Doing things my way has never worked. Throughout all these years, all it's done is create more hatred inside of me. You placed Michaela in my life to show me that I need to trust someone outside of myself if I'm ever going to feel closure. I ignored this lesson and went off on my own again. Please forgive me." As he sucked in a breath, the calmness he'd experienced during his recent Bible readings seeped back in, comforting his troubled heart. After allowing peace to take hold, all he had left was concern over Michaela's well-being. Had she survived? Would he ever even know? How could he bear it if she hadn't, or if she'd sustained permanent damage? Lord, please heal her. Please. The lock rattled, and the door pushed open. His stomach twisted as Johannes himself blocked the doorway, light spilling in around his big frame. What was he still doing here? Why hadn't he killed him? "Right where I left you." In sing-song cadence, the words taunted Eli. At another time, he might have answered with a scathing remark, thinking it the best way to stand up for himself. However, this time, he remained silent. "Nothing to say." Johannes braced a shoulder against the door jamb. "Realizing how stupid coming here alone was, are you?" He clicked his tongue. "Rumor is you're the rash one of the family. You must have gotten that from your old man. He didn't know when to stop either." As much as hearing this man speak of his dad grated, the indignation he would have felt remained absent. Even Johannes's sneer did nothing to disrupt the calm claiming him. "My dad did what he thought was right." How foreign his voice sounded. Eli shifted on his knees, the wooden floorboards cutting into them. "And I did what I thought was right. But this is bigger than you or me. Even you know that deep down." A flash of something, uncertainty, crossed this so-called supreme leader's face before the mockery settled back into the lines it had long carved. "You're talking nonsense. But whatever you need to tell yourself to gain peace in your last hours is fine." Johannes's words were a scare tactic. He wanted Eli to become desperate and do something stupid. He wanted to incite a reaction. Eli had been reacting for years, and it had gotten him here. He wouldn't take the bait. "Do what you want to, Johannes. God will have his way in the end." Where those words came from, Eli had no idea, but as they crossed his lips, he believed them. Johannes scoffed. "You'd better pray to God then, because he's the only one able to save you now." With that, he turned away and slammed the door before once again locking Eli in. Instead of falling back into despair, Eli prayed, "Lord, whatever your plan is in all of this, help me to follow your way. Mine hasn't worked, and I am ready to try yours." In his half-sleep, Eli dreamed his brothers had come to rescue him. That was why Johannes hung around. He was waiting for Eli's brothers to come. He thought he could finish them all. The cabin's front door banged open. Eli sat bolt upright. Had they come? His heart pounded. Dread curled in his stomach. Johannes would kill them all. A man swore. "Who are you, barging in like this?" "International Anti-Terrorist Unit," another man's voice answered. "Hands up where I can see them." Eli scooted to the door and pressed in closer. The tension draining from his every muscle as relief swelled inside him. Not his brothers. Another round of curses issued from Johannes's mouth. "It's over, Horsburden. You're coming with us." Despite being cornered, Johannes released a chuckle. "Think again, sonny." The man ignored him. Where's Carlton? Eli's heart hammered. They knew he was here.
Thank you, Lord. I don't deserve this, but thank you.
He wanted to shout that he was alive, make his presence known, but overcome with emotion, he couldn't speak. Carlton's dead, Johannes spat. Eli Carlton, the man clarified. We know he's here, so there's no point playing games. A shot sounded. The door flung inwards. Eli scooted backwards as an unknown man stepped inside. Carlton, he nodded.
Yes.
The man made quick work of freeing Eli's hands and feet. He helped Eli stand and supported him as they left the room. Freedom had never felt so good. He'd never take it for granted again. Johannes's face contorted. This isn't over, Carlton. It is, Eli's rescuer replied. Turn around and face the wall, Horsburden. You're under arrest. As he was turning, other men burst through the back door, weapons raised. Looks like we're at an impasse, boys. Johannes's grin widened. I'm sure you're well aware my men won't hesitate to shoot. So you have an important decision to make. Do as we say, or die, here and now. That includes you, Carlton. A gunshot rang out. Utter chaos ensued. Eli's instincts and training warred as fiercely as the fighting team's. Everything in his nature demanded he join the fight, but his well-trained mind registered that he was weak and unarmed. So, when one of the unit members ushered him from the cabin, he went without a fight. Get into the car, the man ordered, and stay there. At any other time, a unit member would have stayed with the recovered hostage, but since every man was needed, he was expected to look after himself. He climbed into one of the cars, his chest heaving as the scuffle continued. Although grateful to be free, he closed his eyes as a sense of helplessness returned. He should be in there, helping, not hiding away. He'd just gripped the handle to open the door to get out when the passenger window shattered. Shards of glass tickled his arms as he covered his head with them. When he lifted it, Johannes stood there. You came to get me. Johannes twitched his gun again, using it to beckon Eli. Get out and fight! Somehow, he'd managed to slip through the mayhem and was set on finishing Eli the way he had his father. The League's leader had ignored caution and acted in rage. This was the moment Eli had dreamed of. He climbed out, ready to fight despite his disadvantage, adrenaline surging through him. Johannes stepped back and aimed, his thin lips parting. He pulled the trigger, but as his hand jerked, the shot went wide. Eli lunged forward, knocked the revolver from his hand, and locked Johannes's hands behind his back. Johannes growled as Eli pinned him to the ground and pressed the gun into his back. You Carltons think you can get away with anything, he spat. You're going to pay for this just like your dad did. No, Johannes, you're the one who's going to pay up. Eli stared at the .38 in his hand. The weapon, though not his own, fit so well in his grip. The vendetta so long a part of him. His finger caressed the trigger. Just one little squeeze. That's all it would take to end this. He'd sworn once that, if the chance to kill Johannes presented itself, he'd take it without hesitation. So why couldn't he bring himself to fire the gun now? Even as Johannes struggled against his hold, something in Eli reached out to God. It was never your plan for me to get revenge, was it, Lord? All along, you wanted to teach me how to entrust all outcomes to you. Even if I were to shoot him now, would I feel fulfilled? No. Justice belongs to you. Carlton! 3 members of the anti-terrorist unit were racing towards him. Within moments, they'd taken hold of Johannes. We're lucky you're a trained agent, the agent at Eli's side remarked. I don't know how he slipped through, but your training saved you just now. You're a Carlton, all right. A bittersweet sensation washed over Eli. "You knew my dad?" A twitch jerked the agent's jaw. "I did. He would be proud of you, Eli." As Johannes was cuffed and secured in a squad car, a myriad of emotions surged through Eli. It was over. His father's killer had been captured. But was it too late for Michaela? The agent's phone rang. The man answered and then held it out. "It's your brother, Rob." Eli blinked and took the phone. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Hey, Rob." "Thank God you're all right. We've all been so worried about you and praying non-stop." Eli chuckled. "I've been doing a fair amount of that myself." Now that he had the chance to ask after Michaela, he was almost afraid to. How's Michaela?" "It's a miracle." Tender joy softened his brother's voice. "She woke up and she's going to be fine." Eli's knees buckled as relief coursed through him. No brain damage? None at all. God protected her in the most amazing way. Eli leaned against the squad car, a choked sob escaping. "That's wonderful." "She's been asking about you." His collapsing body jerked to attention. "She has?" Hope buoyed him, although his shoulders sagged. How could he face her after going rogue? She'd be so disappointed. "Yes, she has." "Does she know where I went?" "It didn't take long for her to guess. That's how the anti-terrorism unit knew where to look for Johannes, and for you." "Of course." Eli drew in a deep breath, pushing out the words that needed to be said. "I'm sorry for worrying you. Going off without telling anyone wasn't right." Rob laughed. "It's not like we don't know how you work, little brother." "I know." Eli shifted his weight, switching the phone to the other ear. "But I'm seeing now how wrongly I've handled so many things. Will you forgive me?" "Of course." Rob's voice sounded as thick as Eli's felt. "We're just grateful you're safe." Eli glanced at the agent beside him. "The man who owns this phone, did you know he knew Dad?" "Yeah," Rob answered. "I wish Dad had lived to see this day. You did well, little brother." "Thanks." Eli rubbed his tired eyes. It was over. "See you at home." Home. No place had ever sounded so good. Chapter 15. Michaela peered in the mirror for the 100th time. If only there was some way to spruce up the knitted top she'd pulled over her hospital gown. Sighing, she fluffed her hair, taking care to avoid the bandage. But it looked no different to how it was 2 minutes earlier. At least they hadn't had to shave more than a patch in the back, or so they told her. She hadn't seen what was left in the back under the bandage. But she should have asked Jean to bring some better shampoo. The stuff at the hospital wasn't doing her dyed locks any good. She forced herself to lower the mirror. "Stop it. He knows you had surgery and almost died. He's not expecting you to look like a pageant queen." Butterflies erupted in her stomach whenever she thought of Eli. As eager as he'd been to come home, he'd stayed in Switzerland to get things with Johannes's arrest squared away. Although she'd focused on recovering, the last days had dragged. Sure, she'd been told he was fine, but the danger he'd put himself into made her shiver. She wouldn't relax until she saw him. Then there was the matter of his faith. Despite the good outcome, she couldn't ignore those disappointed twinges over how he'd rushed off on his own, putting his life at risk. But then, everyone made mistakes. Who was she to judge? She leaned back against the pillows, forcing taut muscles to relax. No matter how many times she told herself to act natural, she jolted up each time footsteps sounded in the hall. When his deep voice resounded outside her room, her pulse quickened. He was here! Moments later, he stepped into the room, and their gazes met.
Eli, I'm so glad you're back.
Her chest heaved as she took in the sight of him.
Michaela.
He murmured her name, the tender tones causing her stomach to flip. Her heart pounded as he approached, his gaze intense, his stride purposeful.
I was afraid I'd never see you again.
He reached as though to touch her face, then jerked his hand back and fisted it. She'd been just as afraid of the same thing, and yet...
God was watching over us both.
Yes, but I shouldn't have gone off on my own. He blew out a breath, scowling at the window. I was so angry, impatient. I reverted to my natural desire to take matters into my hands. She touched his arm, drawing his gaze back to her.
I know.
His eyes narrowed.
You're not disappointed in me?
No reason to deny it, she shrugged.
A little.
He ran a hand over his hair. When I learned you might not wake up, this burning desire to make Johannes pay raged through me. I forgot about the quiet I'd let into my soul during our time at the bed and breakfast and at church when I sensed God speaking to my heart. I forgot it all in my haste to find Johannes. It took being locked in a room, bound and helpless, for me to realize I'd let my demons get the best of me again. When I couldn't do anything, I did the most important thing I've ever done in my life. I sat there in the dark and begged for God's forgiveness. Her heart aching for him. She gripped his arm tighter. Tears threatened, but she warded them off. He'd been through so much. Now it was her turn to be strong.
Eli, any humble plea for God's forgiveness will be answered. God heard you.
I know. He nodded. I was prepared to die in that cabin. I'd made peace with God and knew he'd forgiven me for my waywardness. I didn't expect to escape, yet he saw fit to save me. I don't know how long Johannes would have waited for my brothers before he killed me, but I believe the anti-terrorist unit arrived just in time. They could have so easily been unable to find me before it was too late.
God obviously has plans for you.
Awe over his timing and provision filled her, warming her heart and soul.
He really is good.
He absolutely is. Smiling, Eli nodded towards the chair beside the bed. May I sit? She laughed and released his arm. Of course. She studied him while he settled onto the plastic chair, his aftershave teasing her senses. His brow lowered as they shared a pleasant silence. Then he lifted his gaze. Michaela, these crazy past few days, I think it was the wake-up call I needed.
Wake-up call for what?
A tumble of hopeful thoughts and feelings assailed her. She angled her head. He interlaced his fingers, dropping his gaze to them. To get my life right with God. To not waste a single moment trying to manage things in my own strength. Doing that only leads to dead ends and emptiness. He spread his fingers. I've fought God for so long, but you helped me to see that he could be trusted. Even with the most painful things in my life. You have no idea what you've done for me. Her heart tumbled over itself. She blinked. I didn't do anything. God had a plan, and I allowed him to take the reins. But the truth is, you saved my life. Unable to hold back any longer, she stroked his cheek, savoring the roughness of his whiskers beneath her fingertips. His eyes softened as he covered her hand with his. I know you're still in recovery and have been through a lot, but can I get something off my chest?
Yes, of course.
Her heart pounded as their gazes held, and the complete openness in his eyes revealed his heart. He cleared his throat. When you got shot, I held you in my arms and wondered if that was the end. No more chances to talk to you, to hear you laugh, to be with you. He swallowed hard, moving her hand from his cheek, and pressing a kiss to her palm. I realized then how much I felt for you, how much I love you. Her mouth dropped open.
He loves me? I'm not nearly good enough for you, but...
She interrupted him with 2 fingers to his lips.
Don't say that. God is still at work in both our lives.
He clasped her hands.
I still have a long way to go, but after everything that happened, I had to tell you.
The words swelled up in her chest, emerging on a whisper.
Love you too, Eli.
He leaned towards her, capturing her lips with his own, ever so gently. His sweet, undemanding touch made her forget everything. The shooting, the cult and its leader, and even the hospital room. When they broke apart, he enfolded her into his arms. She sank into his embrace, savouring the strength and warmth of his chest as her heart swelled.
Thank you, God, for this, for bringing us together at last, for bringing Eli home to you, for everything.
Chapter 16. When a knock sounded on her apartment door, Michaela set the pitcher of iced tea she'd prepared on the small table. As excited as she was to see Eli, she stalled, one hand on the chilled glass as a shiver threaded through her. She swiped at a bead of condensation, parts of her cold and sweaty like the pitcher over what Eli might be feeling this evening. The 3 months since Johannes's apprehension had been good. Despite the difficult news Eli received soon after arriving back from Switzerland, his decision to go off on his own to hunt down Johannes had come under serious observation. After a great deal of deliberation, the anti-terrorism unit had placed him on suspension for actions considered insubordinate and dangerous. While, to the entire unit and beyond, Eli was being hailed as a hero for bringing down the White League almost single-handedly. He'd been aware there would be consequences for his actions, but that didn't make the news any easier. The unit afforded him proper respect by keeping the suspension quiet to preserve his stellar reputation. During that time, he'd decided to withdraw from law enforcement altogether. He'd assured his surprised family that he'd prayed and was following God's guidance. Through this life-changing decision, Michaela treasured knowing that, no matter how difficult the past few months had been, they'd brought Eli closer to the Lord. She could see it in his eyes and hear it in his voice. He spoke with such peace now, a calm she hadn't witnessed in him before. Although Jean wanted him safe, she voiced concern about what he was giving up. Michaela, however, was convinced he was making the right decision. God had brought him back to himself and had a plan for his life. A plan he would reveal in his own time. This morning, Eli had gone to clean out his locker and say goodbye, concluding his time with the unit. As right as the decision felt, having the hunt for Johannes end with his departure from the career he'd devoted his life to would be difficult. She'd need to be sensitive to that, even as excitement over her own news thrummed through her. Since completing the de-radicalization program and recovering from her latest ordeal, she felt surer than ever about what the future held for her. She couldn't wait to share her idea with Eli. But first, she'd have to open the door. Shaking her head at her hesitation, she crossed the space and flung it open.
Hey!
She braced herself on the door. His smile warmed her as thoroughly as it had the day she knew she loved him. Hey, you. He bent in and brushed his lips against hers. New shivers coursed through her, but she cupped a hand to his cheek, drawing him back enough to see his face.
How did it go today? Are you okay?
He nodded and took her in his arms. Yes, I'm good. With his tightening arms around her, she leaned against him and sighed out any remaining worries.
I was praying for you all day.
Thank you. That means a lot. I feel at peace about leaving. They held each other until she took his hand and pulled him towards the kitchen.
Dinner's ready. I hope you're hungry.
Starving,
He winked. I could eat an ox, but whatever you're cooking smells great. She chuckled. It's just a chicken pie. As she slid the pie from the oven, her stomach churned. It was time to tell him. During the past months, Eli had been supportive of her as she, too, grew in Christ. But what would he think about her current idea? Praying for the right words, she carried the pie to the table and sat across from him. After giving thanks, he served her a section and then himself and dug right in. Enticing smells begged her to taste her work, but she wouldn't dare eat with such knots in her stomach.
Eli, I have something to tell you.
His utensils clattered against the plate as he paused, his brow creasing.
Sounds serious.
His gaze held hers.
I'm all ears.
She took a deep breath, unprepared to explain her ideas. Clearly noting her struggle, he set aside his fork and reached for her hand.
Is everything okay?
She nodded, letting out a silly laugh.
I'm just trying to find the right words.
Just tell it like it is. He squeezed her hand. I'm listening.
All right.
She swallowed hard and held his gaze.
I want to start a program for vulnerable youths who are at risk of being dragged into cult life.
All she could hear was the pounding of her heart as she studied him. What would he think? Would he consider she was aiming too high? She had no formal training in things like this. Letting out a low whistle, he stared at her. Wow, what made you decide that? She leaned closer, turning her hand to return his clasp.
You know how lost I felt after my parents died and Carl and Sally took me in?
He gave a nod, his gaze steady.
I want to stop vulnerable young people from the same fate I suffered. Cults promise a sense of community and belonging, but that fades, and before you know it, you're trapped. I wish someone had reached out and shown me a better way, God's way. I believe I can use my painful experiences to guide others. Imagine it!
An excited laugh escaped.
The struggle I experienced during those years, everything that happened, could help others. I feel that God is waiting to use those experiences for His glory.
Still holding his hand, she sat back and expelled a deep breath.
What do you think?
His eyes shone. I think it's a wonderful idea.
You do?
Why did her voice squeak? It sounded like she was doubting him. He stood and came around the table. Kneeling in front of her, he grasped both her hands, his eyes glowing. I do. I can't imagine anyone better equipped for the task. God has placed a mission on your heart, Michaela. You must follow it. She freed a hand to brush a tear from her cheek.
Thank you. Having your support means more to me than anything.
Their gazes held steady before he gave a small smile. It might be hard for you to believe, but I've also been thinking about how to use what I've been through for God's glory. Sliding her hand back into his, she shook her head.
That's not hard to believe at all. God's been working in your life too.
He peered down at their hands, his thumbs moving absently over the backs of hers. Letting go of being a cop isn't easy, but I feel God pulling me towards something else.
After what you said,
I think I know what. His chin lifted, and a sheen of purpose glazed his eyes.
It might sound crazy, but how would you feel about having a partner help you start this program?
A gasp rushed from her lips as her eyes widened.
You're serious?
His hand came up and cupped her cheek. As serious as I've ever been about anything.
Oh, Eli. God aligned our visions and put us in a place where we can pursue them together. It's so like Him to work things out in ways we could never have pictured. I can't think of anyone I'd rather have by my side than you.
I was hoping you'd say that. Her eyes widened further when he reached into his pocket and produced a small black box. It's a time of transition for us both, he said, his eyes gentle. But I know one thing.
God brought you into my life at the perfect time. The way I see it, the fact that He cleared our paths to make room for this program you envisioned is further confirmation of what I already knew. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Michaela, will you marry me? Tears flowed down her cheeks, blurring her vision of the diamond ring he held. Speechless, she couldn't possibly find the words to express her joy. He chuckled. Do I get an answer? Oops. Grinning, she looked into his beloved face before throwing her arms around his neck. Yes, the answer is yes. Epilogue. 1 year later. Eli forced himself to sit on the hospital waiting room chair, only to spring back up. He'd made it through the first 4 hours of Michaela's labour, but then he'd become so emotional that he'd had to step out of her room for some air. One look at his pale face had his mother insisting he remain at a distance for the duration of the birth. Holly was with Michaela now, and he had to admit she was a far more stable and comforting presence. I've taken down white supremacists and battled terrorism, he muttered as he paced. How is it I can't support my wife through labour? His mother chuckled.
Many men have a hard time with the birthing process. Having to step out is nothing to be ashamed of. Your dad stepped out many times during the birth of each of you boys.
Her words comforted him before he went right back to thinking of Michaela. He stopped feet in front of his mother. When will it be over? She patted his arm.
The doctor will be out as soon as your child is here. Don't worry, son.
As if on cue, the doctor appeared. Eli's heart slammed against his ribcage. It's over? Compassionate and knowing, the doctor's smile settled him. It's over, Mr. Carlton. Go and meet your son. Eli didn't need to be asked twice. He made it to Michaela's room in record time. As exhausted as she looked, he'd never seen her face so aglow.
Did he tell you, Eli? She asked. We have a son.
Eli rushed to her bedside. A love more powerful than he could ever have imagined flooding through him at the sight of their newborn child. He settled down next to Michaela and reached out to stroke the baby's velvety soft head. He's perfect, Michaela. You did amazing, my darling. He bent lower and kissed her lips. She beamed while stroking the baby's tiny fingers. We never did settle on a name, Eli said. She grinned.
I did during labour.
Really? He hadn't been able to think of anything other than trying to breathe. Are you going to enlighten me? Her eyes softened.
George.
His throat closed.
Really? Yes.
She gripped his hand.
I never met your dad, but I know he'd be so proud of both you and our son. His legacy must continue.
Contentment and gratitude steadied him as he gazed at their sleeping child. Thank you, Lord. Your love has freed and blessed me in ways unimaginable. Your goodness is beyond measure. Your loving kindness is everlasting, and your faithfulness is to all generations. Amen. This is the end of Freed by His Love, and is also the conclusion of the Heroes of Eastbrooke series. We hope you enjoyed all the stories in the series and were blessed by them.
If you enjoyed this audiobook, please like, comment, and subscribe to Juliette Duncan's channel, where you can listen to more of her heartwarming Christian romance audiobooks for free.